Chapter 740. Everyone suddenly fell silent. All of the chefs slowly put down their spatulas and kitchen knives as they turned to look at the source of the commotion with incredulity in their eyes. They felt as if they had misheard something. The smiles on Nandel and Vasir's faces instantly stiffened as they looked at the female servants standing in front of Meg's cooking table. Their mouths were wide open, and they felt as if they had been slapped in the face. There was only one chef, and this was his first time cooking at a royal banquet, yet he was going to cook for the king? How could something like this happen? Almost everyone was thinking the same thing, and some of them were even suspecting that the waiter had made a mistake. Father, did I mishear something? I think I misheard as well. Kalulu and his son were also completely dumbstruck, and they were unable to process what was going on. In reality, the waiter was also feeling a little unsure. He had been working at the royal kitchen for over a decade, and this was the first time something like this had happened. He had just confirmed with the commander that this was the chef recommended by the second prince, and that he was going to cook 3 dishes for the king. Only then did he come over. However, seeing as this chef had been recommended by the second prince, he was most likely a decent chef. However, he couldn't tell what was so good about the strange kitchenware on his cooking table, and he didn't even know if the dishes he was going to cook for the king were ready. If something were to go wrong, even he would be implicated. All right, it's ready. Please wait for a moment. Meg nodded with a calm expression. He turned off the magic stove for the braised chicken before removing the lid of the large clay pot. A cloud of white smoke rose into the air, and the aroma of chicken and shiitake mushrooms intertwined to create a delicious aroma that spread in all directions. If the aroma of countless delicacies in the royal kitchen were to intertwine to form a rich, turbid vortex, then the aroma of this aroma was like a sharp blade. This aura was like a sharp blade that broke through the thick vortex, and it successfully stood out from the crowd of muddy auras, and it brought a completely new experience to everyone. This aroma is so unique. It's so delicious that I can smell it. The waiter's eyes lit up. He had been working at the royal kitchen for over a decade, and there were very few delicacies that could make his eyes light up, and all of them were deeply loved by the king. As expected of the chef recommended by His Highness the Second Prince. His Highness is indeed considerate. As the waiter thought to himself, he felt relieved. With this dish, it wouldn't matter even if Meg's next 2 dishes were ordinary. It smells so good. I want to drink chicken soup. Luluka closed his eyes and took a deep breath, swallowing his saliva. Kalulu looked at Meg with admiration. Brother Meg, you're really not an ordinary person. The taste of your food is already comparable to Bellman's. How? How could this be? He's only one person. How could he cook such delicious food? Nandel stared at Meg with incredulity in his eyes, and he felt a stinging sensation on his face. Maybe it just smells good. Making a delicious dish requires the cooperation of many chefs. Take Master Carmen for example. He only needs to be in charge of cooking, and the other chefs will do the rest. That's the only way to make the most delicious food. If he does all the work alone, he won't be able to make a pure and delicious dish, Syval said with a hint of jealousy in his voice. Syval's apprentices all agreed with flattery. This was a dish that was going to be served on the king's table. If they didn't like it, they would be punished severely. The other chefs also looked at Meg with complicated feelings. They felt as if they were looking at a brat who had just entered the world of martial arts and suddenly jumped out, bypassing all the rookies and veterans of the martial arts world to challenge the Wulin Alliance leader. Moreover, he was the one who was allowed to take the stage. It was a very unpleasant feeling. It was as if someone had suddenly torn apart the established rules, and they, who were still waiting in line for a higher position, had suddenly lost an important opportunity. Mag calmly scooped 10 bowls of braised chicken into intricate porcelain bowls, and then scooped 10 bowls of moonlight rice into them before placing them onto the maid's trays. He then closed the trays with a smile, and said, "This is braised chicken and rice. It tastes even better when you pour the gravy over the rice." "All right." The waiter nodded and led the maids out of the restaurant. In the grand hall, all kinds of dishes had already been placed on the tables in front of the VIPs. The orc representative was gnawing on a large bone, the forest troll representative was drinking a large barrel of fruit wine with a long straw, and the goblin representative drank 10 small wine glasses in one go. He secretly hid 2 in his sleeves with a sly look in his eyes. Although it's not as good as father's food, I still managed to eat a lot of delicious food today. Amy was holding a chicken drumstick in her left hand and a fish cake in her right. Her cheeks were puffed up as she spoke in a muffled voice. Crassus looked at his untouched chopsticks and shook his head as he said, "It's not just not as good as Mr. Mac's food. I can't stand eating this food after eating Mr. Mac's food. I'd better save my stomach for Mr. Mac's food later." Mr. Mac is indeed a talent. Novan nodded as he took a sip of tea. He also didn't eat much. Irina took a small bite of each of the dishes in front of her. At this moment, she was looking at the dishes with a conflicted expression as she thought to herself, which dish did he make? There's no name on the dish, so how do I know who made it? I've tried every dish, and they're just ordinary. They're not particularly delicious, but this definitely isn't something that Alex can make, right? Could it be that he's still planning to make roast beef today? I feel like the roast beef tastes better than these dishes, but it doesn't seem appropriate to serve it on such an occasion. Irina shook her head. She still didn't know if she had already tasted Meg's food, or if his food hadn't been served yet. As one of the 10 dukes of the Roth Empire, Duke Abraham also sat near the front of the table. However, he didn't eat much, either. He put down his chopsticks and shook his head as he murmured to himself, "Bellman's dishes are still delicious, but I don't feel like they're any different from last year's. They're all still the same style and menu, so I'm not really looking forward to it. In comparison, the roast beef cubes I had yesterday gave me a pleasant surprise. I have to bring a few more people to try it tomorrow. 3 cubes aren't enough at all." The king didn't eat much either, and his serious expression struck awe and veneration into the hearts of everyone present. Right at this moment, Sean turned to Josh with a smile and said, "I heard that His Highness invited a chef to cook for Father's birthday banquet. Is the dish that he's going to present?" His Highness invited a chef to cook for His Majesty. Chapter 741. It's him. Irina's eyes immediately lit up. She looked at the female servants who were making their way over, and her heart was filled with curiosity as to what kind of dish was under the lid. If Meg could only cook roast beef, then she didn't think that he was a qualified chef. She didn't want to eat roast beef every day from now on. Josh smiled and said, "You've asked at the right time, brother. I invited this chef from Chaos City, and he's the best chef I've ever seen. I hope he'll be able to satisfy Father." A small stir immediately ran through the entire palace. No one thought that the second prince would give such high praise to a chef. The best chef. Did Josh really find such a good chef? And it was found in Chaos City? Abraham was a little perplexed. He counted the number of female servants present, and according to their ranking, it didn't appear that he would be able to eat this dish. If this were a normal royal banquet, he would naturally sit at the very front. However, this was the king's birthday banquet, and all of the representatives of the various races were very important, so the 10 dukes could only sit behind Crassus. "Thank you, Josh." The king nodded, but his expression didn't change much. Sean's pupils contracted slightly, but he still wore a smile on his face as he asked, "Does that mean you think this chef's cooking skills are even better than Bellman's, Your Highness? If that's the case, I'm really looking forward to the food he's going to cook." Flattery was even more vicious than outright criticism. His brother wasn't a general who only knew how to kill on the battlefield. Josh also wore a smile on his face as he replied, "It's hard to say if he's better than Bellman's, but this chef's dishes give me a very special feeling." "Of course Father's cooking skills are the best," Amy said confidently as she munched on a chicken wing. "Then I'll be looking forward to it." Sean nodded and took a deep look at Josh. "We'll know whether that guy is Alex or not after tasting his dishes. Josh has already seen him, but he still allowed him to enter the palace. What is he trying to do?" The conflict between the first prince and the second prince was nothing new in the royal court of the Roth Empire. All of the officials had their own agendas, and even though the ambassadors didn't say anything, all of them were looking at the small trays in the hands of the female servants. The news that King Andre might choose a successor after his birthday had already spread far and wide. No one knew who would win the king's favor, the first prince, who had a large army and the support of the military, or the second prince, who had the support of the mage tower, who had the support of the people, no one knew for sure. In that case, whether or not the two princes could please the king during this birthday banquet might also be a factor that would affect his decision. The dish presented by the chef Joshua had hired might also become a bargaining chip for Joshua. If the king liked it, then it would go in his favor. If the king didn't like it, then the bargaining chip would fall on Sean's side. The entire palace gradually fell silent. Many people craned their necks to look in the king's direction. They all wanted to know what kind of delicacy was hidden on the trays for the second prince to praise it so highly. The servant carried the trays to the king's table with his head lowered. He then removed the lid, and respectfully said, "Your Majesty, this is braised chicken and rice." The other 9 female servants also removed the lids at almost the same time, and placed the braised chicken and rice on the trays onto the nobles' tables. The rich aroma of the chicken and shiitake mushrooms gradually wafted through the air. It was as if a bomb had been dropped into the deep sea, and the fragrant aroma was completely irresistible. A hint of surprise appeared on the king's stern face. He looked at the braised chicken before him, and said with a hint of surprise, "This is..." Irina leaned forward to take a whiff, and her eyes immediately lit up. "It smells so good. This is the aroma of chicken and shiitake mushrooms, but how did the aroma of shiitake mushrooms and chicken become so alluring? This is completely different from the chicken and shiitake mushrooms I've eaten before. Also, this rice is so beautiful, and there's even a little moon in it. Could it be that he really has become a great chef after not seeing him for 3 years? He can actually cook such delicious food. Even the best chef in our clan can't cook shiitake mushrooms and chicken so alluring. No. Looks like he's been coveting my position as the family's chef for a long time, and is trying to learn how to cook in order to replace me. I definitely can't let something like that happen. He and Amy have to eat my cooking in the future. I can't let my talent in cooking go to waste." All of the representatives of the various races were pleasantly surprised and intoxicated. The food they had tasted today was already enough to make them marvel at the culinary prowess of humans, but just the aroma of this dish was already enough to fill them with anticipation. The aroma quickly spread through the palace, and the rich aroma made all of the nobles who hadn't had a chance to taste it gulp as they exclaimed in admiration. "This aroma is simply amazing. Shiitake mushrooms are rare, but who would have thought that cooking them together with chicken would create such a beautiful and alluring aroma? What a genius!" Abraham was stunned, and he craned his neck to look at the braised chicken and rice on Crassus' table. "I can't believe I didn't get a share. This is outrageous." Sean's hands clenched into tight fists before slowly unclenching. He had met this chef the day before, and his cooking skills seemed to have exceeded his expectations. If Josh really did manage to win the favor of his father, then it would definitely be bad news for him. Josh took a glance at Sean, and the smile on his face widened. The chef said that the chicken soup would taste even better if it was poured into the rice, the attendant said in a respectful manner before leaving the palace with all of the female servants. The king picked up his chopsticks and looked at the golden chicken in his bowl, which was completely flawless. The potatoes were cooked but didn't fall apart, and the lettuce was still as green as ever. There were also red and green peppers in the bowl, and the golden broth was not greasy in the slightest. The rich aroma of chicken and shiitake mushrooms wafted toward him, and his appetite was instantly roused. He picked up a piece of chicken with his chopsticks, and his wrinkled face seemed to have lit up in an instant. The delicious broth wrapped around the chicken was exuding a delectable flavor, and it was as if Andre's taste buds had been reawakened. It was like a grassland that had been bathed in spring rain, and it was rejuvenated. Biting open the tender chicken, it was smooth and chewy. The taste of seasoning and shiitake mushrooms had perfectly penetrated into the chicken, making it particularly delicious. After swallowing, the fragrance lingered in his mouth and teeth, and the endless aftertaste made him close his eyes involuntarily. He didn't know when it started, but he didn't find eating interesting anymore. Every day, he would just eat the nutritious food that the royal chef had already prepared for him. Even Bellman's dishes didn't give him any pleasant surprises at all. However, this braised chicken had brought him joy and joy. After swallowing the chicken, He picked up a piece of shiitake mushroom and put it into his mouth. He was completely immersed in the delicious aroma of the chicken, and there was no need for words to praise him. He was completely immersed in the taste. Everyone looked at the king, who had barely touched his chopsticks the entire time, and there was already a slight commotion among them as he continued to eat the braised chicken and rice. Let me see just how delicious this is. Irina also picked up a piece of chicken with her chopsticks. After eating this chicken, big sister Irina will probably fall in love with father. Chapter 742. This flavor, it's indescribable. Irina didn't know how to describe this feeling with words. This was an extreme experience brought about by a delicacy that she had never tasted before. The wonderful taste and smooth texture made her feel as if she could feel the vitality of the fire chicken. The most unique flavor was the shiitake mushroom. This type of delicious mushroom was only occasionally found in the wind forest, but after being dried in the sun, it tasted so delicious. After swallowing the chicken, Irina picked up a spoon and poured a spoonful of broth onto the rice. The moonlight rice absorbed the light golden broth, and the small crescents in the rice grains turned a golden red. She scooped a spoonful of broth into her mouth. The soft rice absorbed the rich chicken broth, and the sweetness of the rice became more and more fragrant as she chewed. It was an extremely delicious experience. What has he been doing for the past 3 years? That man can even roast sweet potatoes into charcoal. How can he cook such delicious food? This is. Irina stared at the braised chicken and rice in front of her with an incredulous expression, but a hint of danger suddenly appeared on her face. Could it be that he doesn't like the food I cook? Is that why he's working so hard to learn how to cook? Is it so that he can one day take over my cooking position? No, I definitely can't waste my talent so easily. Irina shook her head slightly and ate another piece of shiitake mushroom. A blissful and joyful smile appeared on her face, and she couldn't help but praise in her heart, but it really is delicious. In that case, I'll force myself to let him cook 1 meal a day from now on, and I'll still have to cook for the remaining 2 meals. Irina nodded with a determined expression. She looked up at Amy, who had her hair tied up in a beautiful ponytail, and thought to herself curiously, it's been 3 years since we last met, and it looks like I have to get to know him all over again. Cooking, tying up hair. What else has he learned? The forest troll, who was still 3 meters tall, held a bowl that was about the size of his finger, and ate the entire bowl of braised chicken and rice in one gulp. He smacked his lips, and praised, "This chicken is so delicious. The chef recommended by His Highness is indeed very good, but the portion seems to be a little small." The goblin representative took a small bite of the chicken, and glanced at the forest troll with a mocking look. "You're eating such delicious food in one gulp. What a waste. Even women don't eat like you. Can you taste it?" The forest troll retorted. The feud between the two tribes had been building for a long time, and the border war was just as fierce as the war between the Orcs and the Roth Empire. After all, they were in the Roth Empire's royal palace, and it was the king's birthday celebration. Both parties were rather restrained, and didn't get into a fight. All of the representatives were clearly very satisfied with the taste of the braised chicken and rice, and they couldn't stop praising it. When the ministers smelled the fragrance, they all chimed in one after another. If this was just an ordinary dish, it wouldn't be worthy of so much praise, no matter how delicious it was. However, Josh had hired this chef, so rather than praising the dish, they were praising Josh's filial piety and discerning eye. "Is it really that good? I can only smell and look at it, but I can't eat it. This is torture." Duke Abraham couldn't sit still any longer. He swallowed his saliva as he looked at the dish. All he could think about was how he could get some food, but even he didn't dare to do anything in this situation. "Is it really that good?" Sean's expression darkened at the sight of all the praises. He hesitated momentarily before picking up a piece of chicken and putting it into his mouth. Sean's expression became a little complex, but his mouth was still chewing with gusto. This wasn't just delicious, it was delicious to the extreme. The tender chicken had absorbed the fragrance of the shiitake mushrooms, and it was so delicious that he almost chewed on his own tongue. In comparison, Bellman's cooking really was quite mediocre. Looks like he really isn't Alex. He doesn't know how to cook, and there's no way he could be a chef and come to Rodu to cook for father's birthday banquet. Sean put down his chopsticks and looked up at Josh. His younger brother was no pushover. If he really was Alex, he would most likely be the first person to want to kill him. However, he might not be Alex's daughter, but what about her? Could she be Alex's daughter? She was a half-elf of similar age, and she was also a magic prodigy with silver hair and blue eyes. Wasn't this all a little too much of a coincidence? If Alex, who had already become a cripple, had entrusted his child to someone else, then it wouldn't be that hard to understand. After all, he was a cripple who couldn't even take care of himself, so it was no different from killing a newborn child. If she really is Alex's daughter, then perhaps I can get some information about Alex from that chef, regardless of whether he's dead or alive. Sean withdrew his gaze. Finding Alex would be a fatal blow to Josh. No one would support a prince who had murdered Alex to become the new ruler of the empire, as Alex was the hero of the Roth Empire, a true hero of the entire empire. Even though the king had already tacitly agreed to this, Sean wasn't going to let this opportunity slip by. There was only one throne, and he was going to do whatever it took to secure it. He had to find Alex before Josh did, and force him to tell him who was the mastermind behind all of this. Of course, if it weren't for the fact that Josh had been blinded by jealousy, he wouldn't have done something as stupid as leaving Alex alive. As expected, one really couldn't treat a woman with sincerity. Otherwise, one would become an idiot, and one's game of chess would be ruined. The attendant who had been waiting for a while quickly departed with a smile on his face. It seemed that His Majesty and all of the esteemed guests were very pleased, and his heart was finally at ease. Even his footsteps became a little lighter. The royal kitchen was still bustling with activity. The chefs were all busy cooking, and the dishes on the tables of the esteemed guests were constantly being replaced. After all, no esteemed guest would only eat one dish the entire time, and a variety of dishes was one of the special features of royal banquets. However, many of the chefs were paying close attention to the lone chef in the corner. News of that chef from Chaos City cooking for the king had already spread, and attracted a lot of discussion. Chaos City had only been established for just over 100 years, and didn't have much of a heritage. Even many of the chefs here had fled to Chaos City after they couldn't survive in Rodu or other races. For example, the head chef of the #1 restaurant in Chaos City, Duca's Restaurant, had studied under Chef Bellman's disciple for a period of time, so he could be considered to be Bellman's grand disciple. However, at his level, there was no guarantee that he would be able to cook for the royal banquets. As such, the chefs of the Norland continent had always looked down on chefs from Chaos City. Now that a chef from Chaos City had suddenly appeared, and was invited by the second prince to cook for the king, all of the chefs were naturally quite displeased. Chapter 743. Congratulations, Master Meg. His Majesty and all of the nobles are full of praise for your cooking. You have a very good chance of winning the Best Dish award. Right at this moment, the same server from before walked in with the 10 female servants, and even before reaching Meg, he was already very excited. The entire royal kitchen seemed to have fallen silent as astonishment appeared on the faces of all of the chefs present. Ah! The tree man pulled his hand out of the stove, which was on fire, and stuffed it into the water tank beside him with a hint of lingering fear in his eyes. What did it mean to win the Best Dish award? That award meant that one would become the #1 chef in the entire royal kitchen. In a sense, it could be said that one had reached the pinnacle of the cooking world on the Norland continent. In the past, the Best Dish award had almost always been won by Master Bellman. Even if there were some exceptions, the winners would always be the royal chefs of the royal palace. All of them were top-notch chefs in the world of chefs, and were highly respected and well-respected. Even though the Best Dish award didn't completely represent one's ability, it was still a very prestigious award. Being able to stand out among so many top-notch chefs and earn the king's favor naturally meant that one's future was limitless. However, this server was saying that Meg had a very good chance of winning this award, which had always been won by the master chefs. If this server wasn't exaggerating, then wouldn't Meg be the biggest dark horse of this year's royal kitchen? How could this be? Nandel and Vasir's expressions both changed drastically. They had thought that Meg was only a third-rate chef, but who would have thought that even the king was praising him over and over again, and that there was a very good chance that he could win the Best Dish award. Thinking back to what they had just said, they wanted nothing more than to dig a hole and hide in it. What was even more terrifying to them was that if Meg were to become a master chef like Bellman in the future, would they be disqualified from the royal kitchen? They had made a lot of money during the past few years due to their reputation as royal chefs, and all they wanted was for their disciples to continue to make money. However, the tables had suddenly turned, and it seemed that they had offended someone that they couldn't afford to offend, and they were suddenly struck by a sense of panic. Uncle Meg is so awesome. Luluka and Lukaka looked at Meg with admiration. Their eyes were filled with stars. Kalulu blinked his eyes in disbelief. What's wrong with this world? Why is something like this happening to me? You flatter me. Please wait for a moment. The second dish will be ready soon. Meg nodded slightly. He was neither surprised nor happy. He was still as calm as ever. He didn't think that he would be able to secure victory with just a single dish. After all of the best chefs on the entire Norland continent had gathered here. Perhaps his unique taste buds would be a refreshing experience, but that wasn't enough to crush all of the other chefs. He had to give it his all for the next 2 dishes. After all, he had come to Rodu to complete the system mission, and if he failed, he wouldn't be able to bear the consequences. As for the super reward that the system mentioned after the completion of the mission, he was also quite curious. After all, the system had always been stingy. Could it be that it would give him a big gift package? All right. The attendant nodded and stood off to the side without any intention of rushing him. Meg's prowess had already won him over, and barring any mishaps, the royal kitchen was going to welcome another permanent chef. Furthermore, he was going to be one of the most beloved chefs in the empire. In the northwestern corner of the royal kitchen, a middle-aged chef glanced in Meg's direction with a slightly displeased expression on his face. Bellman was wearing a black and white chef's suit with his grey hair combed back, and a tall white hat on his head. Master, that chef from Chaos City, he's the one being praised, so why are you getting all worked up over him? Bellman scooped a spoonful of soup into his bowl before sprinkling some chopped green onions and condiments into it. The chef was a little anxious as he said, but he's just a chef from Chaos City. Even Beat is revered as the #1 chef in Chaos City. How can he compete with you for the best dish at the royal banquet? I refuse to accept this. Exactly. He's only been a chef for a few years. How can he compare with you, master? I think that attendant is just making things up. His Majesty loves master's dishes the most. How could he possibly like that guy's dishes? All of the other chefs chimed in with indignant expressions. In their eyes, Meg didn't even have the right to challenge Bellman, so how could he compete with him for the best dish at the royal banquet? If he really can cook dishes that satisfy His Majesty, then that would be a cause for celebration. Bellman put down the spoon in his hand and looked at the chefs beside him with a serious expression as he said, I've told all of you on more than one occasion that there is no end to cooking. If you want to become a true chef, you have to constantly learn and improve, and you have to constantly innovate. I'm not the height at which all of you can stop, I'm just a stepping stone for all of you. Only then will more delicious and interesting dishes be created. All of the chefs fell silent upon hearing this. Even though they were still a little indignant toward Meg, they had also begun to reconsider Bellman's words. The steak sizzled as it was cooked on the hot iron plate, and the aroma of the steak that had been soaked in red wine and all types of condiments quickly wafted through the air. Black pepper sauce was poured over the medium-well steak, and 2 broccoli flowers and peppers were garnished on top of it. One after another, the black pepper steaks were quickly carried away by the graceful female servants. Nandel and Vasir had already shut their mouths. If it weren't for the fact that they had gone too far with their words, they would have already started to suck up to Tang Wulin. Kalulu also made his way over to Meg with a smile on his face as he said, Brother Meg, I didn't think that your cooking skills would be so impressive. That steak just now looked extremely delicious. You really are a man of hidden talents. If you can become the best dish at the royal banquet, then you'll really become famous overnight. You're far too kind, big brother. I only performed as per normal, I can't afford to become the best dish. Meg shook his head with a smile. He couldn't help but feel like the adjective overnight fame applied to him was a little strange. Within the palace, the king put down his spoon. He had already finished his braised chicken and rice, and there wasn't even a single grain of rice left. The delectable taste of the braised chicken and rice, as well as the rich nutrition of the chicken soup, had made his complexion slightly rosy, and he was still craving for more. All of the other representatives wore similar expressions on their faces. They didn't think that this was going to be an ordinary banquet, but their appetites had been piqued by such a small dish. If it weren't for the fact that they felt that it was inappropriate, they would have already ordered more. His Highness the Second Chef presents his second dish. Chapter 744. The braised chicken and rice was already a pleasant surprise to everyone, and at the same time, it also raised everyone's expectations. If the chef were to only present a single dish, then the braised chicken and rice would definitely be an unforgettable dish. However, the customers would always have higher expectations and more requirements for the same chef. Therefore, whether the second dish would be a surprise or an ordinary one had already become a matter of curiosity in the hearts of the people present. Judging from the king's reaction after finishing the entire braised chicken and rice, it was clear that he was very pleased with the chef that the second prince had hired. This was clearly a very beneficial thing for the second prince. This dish is called the black pepper steak. Chef Meg said that this dish should be sliced with a knife and fork before dipping into the sauce. The attendant carried the steak over to the king in a respectful manner before removing the lid, and the aroma of the steak and wine quickly swept through the entire hall like a tornado. The king's eyes lit up slightly. He didn't have any other hobbies, but he just couldn't live without the small things in his cup, and wine was his favorite. Even though it wasn't to the point of addiction, it had already become a habit for him to fall asleep without drinking a glass of wine every night. The aroma of the wine wafting from the steak was not inferior in the slightest to that of the premium wine that he had ordered from the Buffett winery. Perhaps it was because the steak had been cooked together with the steak, but the aroma of the wine seemed to be even richer than that of his wine. His stomach, which was already somewhat full, started to squirm uncontrollably. He raised his hand and the maid beside him quickly walked over. She picked up the knife and fork and carefully cut the steak into small pieces that were just enough to eat. Abraham took a deep breath, and an intoxicated look appeared on his face as he said, "What an intoxicating aroma of wine. After combining it with the steak, it doesn't feel out of place at all. In fact, it even makes me feel a little intoxicated. Your Highness, you've picked up a treasure." Abraham's eyes were fixed on the steak in front of Josh, and his salivating smile was quite obvious. Josh only hesitated momentarily before turning to the female servant with a smile, and said, "Duke Abraham has always been a foodie, and Josh is pretty much done eating already. Bring this black pepper steak to the Duke." "Really?" Abraham's eyes immediately lit up. "Of course." Josh nodded with a smile. The maid respectfully picked up the steak, walked to Abraham, and put it down respectfully. "Thank you, Second Prince." Abraham expressed his gratitude before sitting down and taking a deep sniff. The aroma of the beef was enhanced by the wine, and there was a unique aroma that elevated the aroma to a whole new level. It was the aroma of black pepper. As a veteran foodie, he was naturally no stranger to black pepper. Perhaps it was because this spice was too expensive. Until now, he had never seen a chef who used black pepper to amaze him. They only used black pepper in cooking to bring some special fragrance to the food. However, at this moment, he found this feeling. After the unique aroma of the black pepper blended with the aroma of the beef, it was so harmonious and alluring. It was as if everything was supposed to be like this, and it was so natural that it was hard to extricate oneself from it. This is simply a genius idea. Abraham couldn't help but praise as he picked up his knife and fork without any hesitation. He carefully sliced off a small piece of beef as if it were a work of art before placing it into his mouth. The beef was even more tender than he had imagined, and as soon as he bit into it, the juices of the meat and red wine flowed out before combining with the black pepper sauce in his mouth. It was as if a magic caster had cast an explosive spell in his mouth, and his calm taste buds were in ecstasy. The rich layers of flavors made him feel as if he were constantly spinning on a delicious roulette, and every second was a wonderful and unique experience. After swallowing, he felt as if a ball of warmth had flowed down his throat, and even his stomach had become warm. It was so comfortable that he almost wanted to moan. What a wonderful taste, a warm and wonderful experience. It's simply irresistible. Is this chef the devil? Abraham sliced off a second piece of beef before placing it into his mouth, and he closed his eyes to carefully savor this wonderful experience. This was the most amazing and delicious food he had tasted during this banquet. The roast beef from the day before was also delicious, but compared to this steak, it was more suitable to be eaten at street stalls. In contrast, sitting in this lavish palace and eating a black pepper steak with a knife and fork was a very elegant and graceful sight to behold. Irina appraised the steak before her, and asked, aside from roast beef, does he know how to cook beef like this? Let me try and see how this steak tastes compared to yesterday's roast beef. Irina sliced off a small piece of beef and put it into her mouth. Her eyes lit up at first, then slowly curved into small crescent moons. A joyful smile appeared on her face, and after swallowing, she even stuck out her pink tongue to lick her lips. As expected of my man, no matter what he cooks, he's always so good at it. It tastes completely different from roast beef, but it's just as delicious. Irina opened her eyes, and an indescribably sweet feeling welled up in her heart. She then sliced off another piece of beef and placed it into her mouth before chewing happily. The smile on her face had Josh completely entranced. Sigh, as expected, no one can resist father's charm after tasting his cooking. Amy looked at Irina and shook her head before turning her gaze to Josh. She then followed his gaze back to Irina, and her brows furrowed as she murmured, could it be that this little white mouse is lusting after my beautiful big sister Irina? No. She belongs to father. I'll keep an eye on you. Where did the second prince find this chef? His culinary skills are so good that even His Majesty is so pleased with him. Indeed, this is more pleasing to His Majesty than any other gift. The second prince is truly very thoughtful. The officials who were familiar with each other were discussing quietly among themselves. Josh had clearly achieved his goal with this dish offering. Luna, could this chef be the Mr. Meg that you were talking about? The elderly man sitting beside Luna asked with a surprised expression. According to Luna, Mr. Meg had only come to Rodu at the invitation of the second prince. However, a prodigy with astonishing aptitude for mathematics was also an astonishingly talented chef. Yes, grandfather. He is Mr. Meg. His main job is as an exceptional chef and restaurant owner, and mathematics is his hobby. Byron Field faltered slightly upon hearing this before sighing with emotion as he said, he's able to reach heights that others would never be able to reach with just his hobby. I'm looking forward to meeting this young man more and more. Indeed, he's a prodigy. Luna nodded as a hint of reverence appeared in her eyes at the thought of that gentle and talented man. This one is for His Majesty, these two are for the first prince and second prince, this one is for the elven princess, this one is for Master Crassus, and the rest are for all of our esteemed guests. They all have different tastes, so make sure you don't mix them up. Meg issued a serious reminder to the servants before looking on with a sweet smile on his face. Chapter 745. The braised chicken and rice and black pepper steak struck quite a blow to the hearts of the guests who couldn't eat the dishes. They could only look at the dishes but not eat them, and they had to endure all kinds of compliments and reactions, which was driving them crazy. When the king swallowed the final piece of beef and revealed a satisfied smile, everyone thought that everything was over. In the end, the chef invited by His Highness presents the third dish. A demonic voice rang out from the entrance of the palace, and 2 rows of female servants strode in from the entrance. Each of them was holding a long platter that was twice the size of the previous 2. There's more. The king was also rather surprised. He had already eaten more than his usual appetite for the braised chicken and rice and black pepper steak, and it could be said that the chef had indeed given him a craving for food. The fact that a chef could cook 2 such delicious dishes was already a testament to his abilities, and Josh had indeed put in a lot of effort. He didn't think that there would be a third dish after eating 2 dishes. Even though he was already feeling a little full, he was still looking forward to it. Putting aside whether he could eat it or not, the third dish on the platter really did pique his curiosity. The food was delicious, but Sean couldn't bring himself to eat it, and he was feeling rather depressed. Was Josh going to stop this? He was beginning to regret not killing Meg the day before. Even though that would have worsened his relationship with Josh, it would have saved him some trouble. On the contrary, Josh was in such a good mood that he wanted to sing at the top of his lungs. However, he had to control his expression and emotions in the palace, so he couldn't display too much joy. "Your Majesty, this dish is spicy grilled fish. Please enjoy." The servant opened the platter, and a grilled fish covered in red chili peppers appeared before everyone's eyes. A slightly spicy aroma wafted toward the king, and his brows furrowed slightly. However, to his surprise, the spicy aroma of the red chili peppers wasn't as pungent as he had imagined. Instead, it was more fragrant and spicy, and the aroma was even more pronounced than the spicy aroma. The spicy aroma stimulated his already satiated stomach, and he was struck by the urge to pick up his chopsticks again. Under the chili was a whole fish. The skin of the fish was slightly yellowish. Under the crisscrossing knife, one could see the plump flesh of the fish that had been dyed red by the gravy. It was the kind of feeling that made one want to eat it. A faint smile appeared on Josh's face at the sight of the king's expression. It seemed that his father had also approved of the dish that he was most worried about. During this banquet, his father had almost only eaten the dishes cooked by Meg, so the best dish of the day was definitely going to be Meg's, which was good news for him. The maids lifted the lids on the trays before carefully placing the grilled fish onto the table. The strong spicy aroma wafted through the air like a pepper bomb. "What is this?" Sean subconsciously leaned back. The hot spicy smell that assaulted his face stung his eyes. That kind of spicy smell was almost tangible. Just a whiff of it made his throat itch a little. Josh sat in front of the 4 portions of insanely spicy grilled fish, and smiled as he said, "There's no need to be so alarmed, Brother King. This is a spicy grilled fish, and it's renowned for its spiciness. It smells spicy, but it's extremely spicy when you eat it." He had thought that Meg had reduced the amount of chili, but from the smell of the grilled fish, it seemed to be even more spicy than the last time. But what could he do? Meg was his chef, so no matter how spicy the food was, all he could do was sit there and smile as if he were enjoying it. It was so fragrant that he was on the verge of tears. Josh took a glance at the calm king, and heaved an internal sigh of relief. At the same time, he couldn't help but praise internally, "I didn't think that father would be so fond of chili. It looks like he has guessed father's taste buds. That's a huge contribution." The spiciness of the grilled fish had already exceeded the tolerance range of the average person, and Sean was just about to complain when he saw that the king had already picked up his chopsticks, and he swallowed the rest of his words. "This grilled fish is so spicy, but it's so fragrant. Indeed, this fish is a little small, but it should taste quite good. It's just that I don't really like to eat small fish, the fish bones are too small." All of the representatives looked at the spicy grilled fish before them with some hesitation, but at the same time, they also wanted to try it. The previous 2 dishes had given them a very high expectation for the 3rd dish. However, the fiery red chili and the strong spicy aroma had become an obstacle for them to move their chopsticks. For a moment, no one moved their chopsticks. "Is it really that spicy? Why do I feel like my grilled fish is very fragrant, and it's not that spicy?" Irina took a deep whiff of the grilled fish in front of her before looking at everyone with a perplexed expression. Then, she murmured to herself, "I didn't think that he would even know how to grill fish. Is there anything that he can't cook, be it flying in the sky, swimming in the water, or running on the ground? This really is a huge threat to my position." Just as everyone was hesitating about whether they should eat the grilled fish, the king had already picked up his chopsticks and placed a piece of fish into his mouth. His lips moved slightly, and a faint smile appeared on his face. The fine wrinkles on his face slowly disappeared like ripples. This was a joyous smile that came from the bottom of his heart, and it was the best compliment he could give to the dish. After swallowing the piece of fish, the king turned to everyone and nodded as he said, "This is a very delicious piece of fish, you should all have a taste." "Yes, father." Josh immediately picked up his chopsticks and picked up a large piece of fish. The red gravy had already stained the meat of the fish red, and a strong spicy aroma wafted toward his nose. He forcibly resisted the urge to back away as he placed the piece of fish into his mouth. In the blink of an eye, Josh felt as if his mouth and tongue had already gone numb. His face instantly turned red, and sweat began to bead on his forehead. He had already experienced this feeling once the day before yesterday, but this time, the feeling was obviously more intense. His tongue and mouth were completely numb, and the strong spicy taste rushed straight to his brain, causing his mind to almost go blank. Tears were already swirling in his slightly red eyes, but he just had to forcefully endure and not let himself cry out. "I just need to hold on for a little while longer." Josh clenched his fists as he prayed in his heart. The numbness and blankness persisted for a while before finally subsiding. What followed was the extreme deliciousness of the tender and delicious fish, which slightly overshadowed the spicy sensation. In that instant, all he could taste was the delicious flavor of the fish. One mouthful of fish after another, only the deliciousness of the dish could completely overwhelm the spiciness. Josh's face was as red as if he had just come out of a furnace, and his forehead and body were already drenched in sweat. This feeling really was unbearable. Sean took a glance at Josh, who was enjoying his meal. His father had already spoken, so he could only grit his teeth and pick up a piece of fish before putting it into his mouth with some difficulty. Sean's face almost instantly turned the color of pig's liver. He had already lost all feeling in his tongue and mouth, and in that instant, he almost wanted to spit out the fish. However, he could see that Josh was enjoying his meal across from him, and he forcibly repressed that urge. His hands were tightly clenched into fists under the table. This level of spiciness was not something that a normal person could handle. However, in a situation like this, if he were to do something inappropriate, then all of his previous efforts would be for naught. His father would never allow a disgraced prince to become the king. Chapter 746. Sean had experienced countless life-and-death battles on the battlefield and crawled out from piles of corpses. Compared to Josh, who had never left Rodu, he had sacrificed a lot for the throne. As someone who didn't like spicy food, he was almost about to faint in the face of such terrifying spiciness. He clenched his fists so tightly that his fingernails dug deeply into his flesh. His eyes had also turned red, but he could only repress the urge to cry out. Was this level of spiciness really something that humans could tolerate? Why was father able to enjoy it so much? Or did Josh get that chef to add more spicy food to mess with him? Countless questions flashed through Sean's mind, and he was struck by a murderous urge. Just as he thought that this spiciness was going to last for a long time, the numbness in his lips and tongue began to dissipate, and the delectable taste of the fish began to soothe his numb mouth. The crispy fish skin, the tender fish meat, and there wasn't even a single bone in the fish. The deliciousness hidden within the spiciness was so incredible that it had broken through the blockade of the spiciness and struck directly at his soul. It was as if rain had suddenly descended upon a desert that had been parched for thousands of years. This was an indescribable feeling, but it also successfully suppressed the spiciness. His throat moved a little, and he swallowed the fish. The fish meat was like scorching lava that had just been scooped out of an active volcano. The spiciness slowly slid down his throat, and it was as if a ball of fire had been ignited within his body. The twisting and convulsing of his stomach made him feel rather uncomfortable, and the spiciness in his mouth gradually returned, as if there were countless tiny ants gnawing on his flesh. His rationality told him that it was best not to touch the fish again, but he couldn't help but pick up a second piece of fish meat with his chopsticks and place it into his mouth. The delicious fish meat successfully suppressed the spiciness, but what followed was an even more spicy experience, and this feeling could only be suppressed by eating another piece of fish meat. Sean suddenly understood what Josh meant when he said that he couldn't stop eating the spiciness. He couldn't stop even if he wanted to. However, Josh didn't seem to be doing much better than him. His face was flushed, and he was sweating profusely, but he was also unable to stop eating. Looks like the two princes can't stop eating. Is this spicy grilled fish really that delicious? Indeed. The two princes really are true people to be so immersed in delicious food. When the ministers saw this scene, they were all surprised. The two princes had always been very cautious in front of others. Who would have thought that they would be eating in such an unpretentious manner in the palace? In fact, They even appeared to be in a slightly disheveled state. This was quite surprising, and it was clear that the spicy grilled fish was extremely delicious. Who? The forest troll representative opened his mouth and spat out a ball of flame, which landed on his leg and set it ablaze. Fortunately, Richard, who was sitting to the side, had quick reflexes and raised his hand to extinguish the fire with a water ball spell. This small fish is really delicious, but the spiciness is really not simple. Even I have learned how to breathe fire. The forest troll put down the bowl in its hand with lingering fear. Only the main bone of the grilled fish was left, and its originally withered yellow body had turned dark red. It was a rather comical sight. It's indeed very delicious, especially this hot and spicy feeling. It's really awesome. The abyssal demon's skin was also covered with a layer of faint red, and it wore an excited expression as it ate mouthful after mouthful of fish. Looks like aside from the spiciness, it's pretty good. Irina nodded in agreement. She picked up a piece of fish with her chopsticks and dipped it in the red broth. She blew on it before carefully placing it into her mouth. The spicy broth made the tip of her tongue and lips feel slightly numb. This was a very special feeling, as if someone had suddenly pinched the tip of her tongue, causing her to temporarily lose some of her senses. Immediately thereafter, the delicious flavor of the fish began to wreak havoc in her mouth and on the tip of her tongue. The crispy skin of the fish was crispy but not charred, and the flesh beneath the skin was extraordinarily tender and bouncy. The fragrant and spicy broth soaked through the flesh of the fish, and the spicy and tangy texture whetted her appetite. After swallowing the fish, she felt as if a ball of warm fire was slowly flowing down her throat into her body, warming her stomach and body, giving her a sense of comfort and enjoyment. Vivian didn't really like eating fish as she always had no way to deal with the small fish bones, and the feeling of having something stuck in her throat was very uncomfortable. However, to her surprise, there were no small fish bones in that piece of fish, only fresh and tender flesh. Is it a fish without any fish bones? Irina's eyes lit up as she picked up another piece of fish and placed it into her mouth. The fish melted almost immediately in her mouth, and there were also no small fish bones. Instead, there was only a fragrant and spicy texture. It's a little numb and spicy, but it's not as bad as what they're saying, is it? Could it be that I actually have a talent for eating spicy food? Irina took a peculiar glance at Josh and Sean before placing another piece of fish into her mouth. Her eyes narrowed slightly as a blissful smile appeared on her face. But this grilled fish really is delicious. The spicy texture paired with the fresh and tender flesh of the fish doesn't feel greasy at all. No one can resist Father's cooking, it's just that delicious. Amy picked up a piece of fish with her chopsticks and placed it into her mouth as she swayed from side to side with an elated smile on her face. Father really is super awesome, anyone who eats his cooking will fall in love with it. Duke Abraham gulped down his saliva as he looked on. There was no way he could eat the grilled fish, and he thought to himself, after this banquet, I'm definitely going to get that chef to make a separate set of braised chicken and rice and spicy grilled fish for me. All three dishes are extremely popular with His Majesty. Looks like the best dish of the banquet has already been crowned. Isn't that so? His Highness really has a sharp eye for talent. Speaking of which, that little girl looks so adorable when she's eating. Which family is she from? I heard that Master Crassus recently accepted a half-elf disciple. It's most likely her. I heard that Master Crassus took his disciple to the Magus Tower to wreak havoc yesterday. His disciple broke the Magus Tower's tower ascension record and beat President Richard's disciple to tears. That woman is truly terrifying. All of the officials were discussing quietly among themselves, and their gazes toward Amy had changed significantly. By the time the king put down his chopsticks, he had already eaten more than half of the spicy grilled fish, but the strong sense of satiety still forced him to repress the urge to finish the rest of the grilled fish. He accepted a handkerchief from a waiter and wiped his hands and mouth before looking up at the sweaty Josh and Sean, who were still munching on the grilled fish without a care in the world, and his brows furrowed slightly. Josh and Sean seemed to have sensed the king's gaze, and their expressions changed slightly as they put down their chopsticks in unison. At this point, only the head of the grilled fish remained in front of them. As soon as they stopped, cold sweat began to appear on Josh and Sean's foreheads. The numbness in their lips and the scorching sensation in their throats immediately surged forth, and the scorching sensation made them want to pick up the plate of grilled fish in front of them and take a sip of the spicy soup. Chapter 747. As expected of the best dish. This chef is most likely going to become the new favorite of the royal kitchen. Even the first 3 dishes were so well received by His Majesty. I wonder what His Majesty will reward him with. His Highness is indeed a good judge of character. He must have put in a lot of effort to find such an exceptional chef. The servants quickly went to invite Meg over, and the officials began to discuss quietly among themselves. Many of the second prince's officials naturally wouldn't let go of such a good opportunity to praise Meg. The officials of the first prince's faction did not look too good. The birthday celebration had just begun, and the second prince had already been in the limelight. They did not expect him to make such a strange move. Making a fuss at the palace banquet was out of everyone's expectations. Josh and Sean weren't in the mood to think about that. The scorching sensation on their lips was unbearable, and the burning sensation in their throats was even more unbearable. Sean picked up a glass of wine from the table and downed it in one gulp. Like a catalyst, the burning sensation in his throat became even more intense, and he had to force himself not to spit out the wine. "Get me a flask of ice water and put more ice in it," Josh said to the maid beside him. Josh whispered to the maid beside him. He had tasted the spicy grilled fish 2 days ago, and he had to drink a large pot of ice water to alleviate the spiciness. After drinking the ice water, he felt extremely refreshed. "Master, does that mean Father is going to take first place?" Amy asked as she looked up at Crassus. Crassus nodded with a smile, and replied, "That's right. Mr. Mac's grilled fish has already been designated as the best dish of the day by the king. In other words, it's the best dish of the day, so it's naturally going to take first place." Novan also nodded, and said, "Mr. Mac is a genius. Normally, all chefs who have won the best dish of the day will stay in the palace to become royal chefs. Is Mr. Mac not going back?" Crassus asked. "Mr. Mac will definitely go back." A smile appeared on Novan's face. "Other than discussing the revision of the peace agreement, I'm here to bring Mr. Mac back to Chaos City." Crassus looked at Novan in confusion. "Since when did chefs become strategic resources? You, a dignified 10th-tier great magician, actually made a trip for a chef." Novan smiled but didn't say anything. "As expected of my man. No matter what he does, he always does his best." Irina put down her chopsticks with a satisfied look on her face. She let out a small burp as she wiped her mouth with a silk handkerchief. Although she wouldn't gain weight no matter how much she ate, she hadn't eaten so much in a long time because she couldn't find any food that could make her unable to stop eating. If that's the case, after raising him for 3 years, not only will he learn how to take care of children, but he will also learn how to cook. Then, taking him back seems to be a gain. Irina thought to herself as her gaze fell upon Josh. Her expression turned cold as she said, "However, I'm going to find all of the people who were involved in this incident. I'll skin you alive and let you know what cruelty is." After the 3 dishes were completed, Meg had already begun to clean the kitchen utensils and pack up. He appeared to be quite relaxed. Meg appeared to be very relaxed on the surface, but he was actually feeling a little uneasy. After all, he was here on a mission from the system. If he didn't take first place, it would be very awkward for him to fail the mission. There were too many uncertainties in this mission, and it was purely based on the king's preferences. Although the waiter had said that the king was very satisfied with the first 2 dishes, there was still no way to confirm whether the best dish would be selected. The dishes had already been served, and the bustling cafeteria instantly fell silent. Although there was no need to cook anymore, there weren't many chefs who could wash their pots as leisurely as Meg. All of the chefs were waiting to see who would win the Best Dish award. This was the highest honor in the world of chefs, and everyone who could come here wanted to win this honor. The Best Dish award will definitely go to Master again. Master has already won the Best Dish award for 9 consecutive years. If he wins it again, it will be an unprecedented 10 consecutive wins. Indeed, His Majesty loves eating Master's dishes the most, and that hasn't changed even after so many years. All of the chefs around Bellman wore confident expressions, and they seemed to be ready to celebrate. Bellman's expression was still as calm as ever, and he was carefully wiping his stove with a handkerchief, as if he didn't care about the result at all. Nandel took a glance at Meg, who was cleaning his stove, and said in a slightly peculiar manner, "If you ask me, Master Bellman will definitely win the Best Dish award. The other chefs are still lacking compared to him. Indeed, not just anyone can win the Best Dish award. No one knows His Majesty's preferences better than Master Bellman," Vasir chimed in with a hint of schadenfreude in his smile. They had thought that Meg would really be able to win the Best Dish award for the first two dishes, but the spicy aroma of the fish he had cooked was so strong that even they couldn't stand it. All of the chefs present knew that the king didn't like spicy dishes, but Meg had committed this taboo, so perhaps he was going to be reprimanded because of this dish. "Brother Meg, are you really going to be all right after putting so much chili in that fish?" Kalulu stood off to the side with reddened eyes as he looked at Meg with a concerned expression. He wasn't crying because he was too pessimistic. Instead, it was because Meg had told him to stand further away when he was putting in the chili, and he didn't pay attention to the spicy aroma. "Indeed, it's so spicy that I can't even open my eyes. I can't see anything now." Luluka and Lukaka narrowed their eyes, and they couldn't even see the small fish anymore. "I'll be fine, I guess." Meg shook his head with a smile. He had put in the king's portion of chili, and he had only added Josh and Sean's portions of insanely spicy. Amy's portion was medium spicy, and Amy's favorite was that level of spiciness. He had also put in the chili for Irina's portion of chili. Elves tended to prefer bland flavors, and Sally's favorite level of chili was medium spicy. As for everyone else, he had put in the super spicy dish. Even if they wanted to hold a grudge, they would most likely hold it against Josh. He was even regretting that he hadn't put in the insanely spicy dish for them. Perhaps this was his selfishness. Meg didn't take Nandel and Vasir's words to heart. This was like a battle between two experts. If he were to stomp on a little chick, then he would be lowering his status. Chapter 748. The entire royal kitchen suddenly fell completely silent. Almost all of the chefs turned toward the servant who was making his way toward Meg with astonishment etched on their faces. How is this possible?" Vasir's mouth gaped open, and he could hardly believe his ears. Nandel's eyes turned white, and he directly fell backwards. His disciple was so scared that he hurriedly reached out to support him, extremely flustered. Everyone had been trying to guess who the best dish of the banquet would be, but no one would have thought that the award would go to a completely unknown chef from Chaos City. A tall and thin chef beside Bellman stepped forward with an incredulous expression, and yelled, "That's impossible. Steward Tyron, have you made a mistake? How could the best dish of the banquet be won by a completely unknown chef? Isn't His Majesty's favorite food Chef Bellman's?" "That's right. Master has won the best dish of the banquet for 9 consecutive years. How could he lose? Master cooked over 10 dishes today, and he only cooked a few dishes. There must be a mistake somewhere." Bellman's disciples all began to voice their doubts with indignation etched on their faces. All of the other chefs also chimed in agreement. There was only one best dish of the banquet, so it was much easier for them to accept the award being given to a renowned chef like Bellman rather than a young chef from Chaos City. Bellman had also stopped wiping the stove, and a hint of dejection appeared on his face. However, he wasn't too enraged or agitated either. Tyron stopped in his tracks. As a trusted servant of the king, he naturally knew that Bellman had been the king's favorite chef for the past few decades. However, the dark horse that had appeared out of nowhere today was far too powerful. Bellman's reputation seemed to have been overshadowed by the fact that he had won the Best Chef award at the palace banquet. It was understandable that his apprentices had doubts about Bellman. However, it was no small matter to question the king's decision. A serious expression appeared on Tyron's face as he said, "The best dish of the banquet was awarded to His Majesty in front of all of the guests, and there's no mistake about it. All 3 of Mr. Meg's dishes have been praised by the king and all of the guests, and he deserves the best dish of the banquet. He was even summoned to the palace to receive his reward, so there's no question about it. Also, Mr. Meg is not some unknown chef. He is a chef personally invited by His Highness the Second Prince. Tai Lun's words were like a bucket of ice water poured over them. The dining hall quieted down once again. The chef's expressions changed slightly, but they didn't dare to say anything. Since His Majesty had already allowed Meg to go to His Majesty's palace to receive his reward, this was already a foregone conclusion. The smile on Bellman's face grew even wider, and he let go of Tang Wulin's hand. Let's go then. It's quite interesting to win this award for the first time. Of course, once you win more, you won't care about it anymore. Okay. Meg nodded at Bellman's smile. He was a generous old man, after all. He quickened his pace and caught up with Tai Lun. After exiting the dining hall, Tai Lun led Meg toward the dining hall. Along the way, Tai Lun gave him a few reminders of the taboos and etiquette that he had to follow. After all, this was his first time going to the dining hall, so Meg naturally committed all of these to memory. In a feudal society like this, a single misstep could result in his head being chopped off by the king. Ding. Congratulations, host. Your spicy grilled fish has defeated chefs from all over the Norland continent and received the title of Best Dish. You have also completed a system mission and received a super reward, a chance to recover to your peak power for a short period of time. At the same time, your restaurant has been upgraded to level 3, and you can check all of the restaurant's privileges and upgrades after you return to your restaurant. Right at this moment, the system's voice sounded in Meg's mind. Holy fuck! Meg exclaimed upon hearing the system's words. Tai Lun turned to Meg with a perplexed expression. I hope that the host can learn from this system's spirit. Forget it. If you have the time, go and study how to successfully cook a sheep. Meg rolled his eyes and looked at the magnificent hall in the distance. He took a deep breath and quickly followed Tyrone. The female servants cleared away the sumptuous banquet and replaced it with fresh fruits and desserts. Everyone was waiting for the chef who had won the best chef of the palace banquet. A chef who had been recommended by the second prince and had successfully moved His Majesty with his delicious food would definitely become a hot commodity in the eyes of many people. Everyone was curious about what kind of person that person would be. To be able to cook such delicious food, he must be an old man, right? What a pity. All of the female guests were feeling rather forlorn. If he were to announce his identity to the entire Norland continent, he would definitely cause a huge stir. However, someone has already taken the blame for what happened back then, so there's most likely no one who would be implicated by this matter. Irina looked at the entrance with furrowed brows. If he's not an idiot, then why did he accept Josh's invitation to come back to Rodu and win the award of the best chef of the banquet? Irina was still unable to understand Meg's actions. He was clearly no longer as powerful as he had been in the past. No matter how perfect his disguise was, it was impossible for him to be completely flawless in front of so many familiar faces, let alone in a situation where he was the center of everyone's attention. No matter what, I'm going to protect you and Amy this time. I won't let anyone hurt you two again. Irina vowed in her heart. She took a glance at Amy, who was munching on a large apple, and a gentle look appeared in her eyes. Is that Mr. Meg really the person who won the award of the best chef of the banquet? Byron looked at Luna with incredulity in his eyes. Mr. Meg, who had come up with the multiplication table, was a genius who had provided him with the most powerful support and tools for his advancement in mathematics. Even he, who had been immersed in mathematics for several decades, couldn't help but be astonished by this. However, a genius mathematician like him had won the award of the best chef of the banquet. This stark contrast and absurdity made him feel as if he couldn't believe that this was real. Luna nodded with a smile. That's right. Mr. Meg's cooking is the most delicious food I've ever tasted, and he's also the most talented mathematician I've ever seen. The younger generation will surpass us in time. Byron sighed with emotion as he looked at the entrance of the palace with even more anticipation in his eyes. Indeed, he's someone that I can only look up to. Luna thought to herself as she also looked at the entrance of the palace with anticipation in her eyes. Mr. Meg had never disappointed anyone, and this time was no exception. Richard's expression darkened slightly. Even though this chef was invited by Joshua, and he had stolen all the limelight for Joshua, this guy was the half-elf brat's father. If it weren't for Crassus and Joshua, Richard would have killed him on the spot. As for Joshua and Sean, they didn't have any other thoughts at the moment. All they wanted to do was to hold on to the ice kettle and suppress the burning sensation as soon as possible. Chef Meg has arrived. Right at this moment, a thin voice sounded from outside the palace. Everyone's eyes turned toward the entrance of the palace in unison. Tyron was the first to walk into the palace, and behind him, a young man in a black and white chef's robe followed. This man was tall and slender, and his black and white chef's robe was fitting for him. His short brown hair looked very neat, and his handsome face paired with a faint mustache gave him a sense of calm and roguishness. There was also a gentle smile on his face. Is this the chef? Oh my God, he's so handsome. Chapter 750. Meg slowly walked over with a smile on his face. He appeared calm and kind, and his meticulous chef's robe was not stained with oil at all. It was impossible to tell that he was a chef who had just walked out of the kitchen. He can cook good food, and is able to go to the banquet hall. He's a perfect match. I've always wanted to marry a man who can cook, but the men who can cook are all old men. I didn't expect such a handsome man to exist. Father, will the best chef at the palace banquet be given a noble title? Will he be worthy of our family? The eyes of the young ladies lit up. A chef who could make delicious food that even His Majesty the King praised, and who was also so handsome, was simply too attractive. They could not close their legs to describe their feelings at this time. These shameless women dare to steal my man. Irina's cold gaze swept over the women, and a dangerous glint flashed in her eyes. The women felt a chill run down their necks, and they subconsciously shrank back. They looked left and right, a little confused. Hearing those women's words, Meg's smile became a little smug. There was no imperial examination in this world, but as a chef, he had achieved success in one fell swoop. Even these noble ladies couldn't help but admire him. It seemed that his charm was not to be underestimated. Meg was feeling smug when he suddenly met Irina's cold gaze. It was as if he had suddenly fallen into an Antarctic glacier from a 45-degree desert. The cold feeling caused the smile on his face to instantly freeze. He subconsciously shivered, and immediately put on a serious expression. Holy fuck. Do you have to be so scary? I almost forgot that there's a princess here. Meg's little heart trembled, and he felt like he would be frozen into an ice cube if he were to act recklessly for another second. Me. At least you know what's good for you. Irina retracted her gaze, but she was still a little annoyed. In the past, he wouldn't even look at other women, but now he was so proud of them. Meg turned his gaze to Amy and flashed her a smile. Although they had been separated for an entire morning, he wasn't worried at all that she wouldn't be full. Everyone in the banquet hall might not be full, but Amy was definitely full. Father. Amy also waved happily at Meg, but she was smart enough not to make a sound. Meg also saw Luna and nodded slightly. The person sitting beside her should be her grandfather, the drunken and long-winded old man in Alex's memory. Byron looked at Meg and sighed. I didn't expect him to be so young. If the multiplication table can be popularized, his name will be forever recorded in the annals of history. The ministers felt the same way. They did not expect Meg to be so young. One had to realize that head chef Bellman was already in his 60s, and he had been the head chef of the imperial kitchen for close to 30 years, yet he had lost to a young man who appeared to be no more than 30 years old. Meg was not nervous at all. After all, in his previous life, he was someone who dared to jump on the stage of a music festival and pretend to be a guest. He could handle this kind of situation. However, he did find a lot of familiar faces in Alex's memory. Many of the ministers in the court had already chosen to side with either Joshua or Sean, but there were also a lot of people who did not choose to side with either of them. They were fence-sitters, or they were on the king's side. In Meg's view, this battle for the throne was a magnified version of a battle for the family's inheritance, except that the losing side would be fatal. It was a pity that he didn't have an elder brother or younger brother to fight for the family's inheritance with him in his previous life. Otherwise, he would know how to participate in such an interesting event. As for the protagonists of this battle for the throne, Meg took a look at the two princes, whose clothes were soaked in sweat and were still holding onto a jug of ice water, and his mood immediately lightened. Josh forced a smile at Meg. Although the current situation was a little difficult, Sean was in a similar situation. Most importantly, the Emperor was happy, and Meg was his lucky star. Meg returned an apologetic smile, but he was actually laughing in his heart. Sean's resentful and angry gaze was completely ignored by him. How dare you two little bitches plot against me back then? The spiciness was just the beginning. According to the system's warning, 3 times the insanely spicy level would change the quality of the food. Tyron led Meg forward before respectfully retreating to the side. Meg composed himself and looked at the king, who was sitting on the throne, and bowed respectfully. Commoner Meg pays his respects to your majesty. The king looked at Meg with a hint of surprise. He raised his hand and said, "No need for formalities. I didn't think that you would be able to cook such delicious and unique dishes at such a young age." Meg straightened up and said humbly, "I am indebted to your majesty. Compared to many of my seniors, I am still very inexperienced. I am truly ashamed to receive such an honor." The king, who had been on the throne for over 40 years, was a lot older than 3 years ago in Alex's memory. His originally black hair had turned gray, and the wrinkles on his face were a lot more obvious. However, he still had a powerful aura that could not be ignored as he sat on the throne. He was like an elderly lion king, still able to protect his territory. Meg was still unsure whether the incident 3 years ago had anything to do with him. However, the way he handled the matter after that proved that he had at least tacitly approved of the incident, and he was even more biased toward Josh, which was why he had used a few demons to suppress the matter. The king shook his head with a smile, and said, "You may be young, but your culinary skills have already reached the pinnacle. All 3 dishes are extremely delicious, so there's no need to be humble." Meg withdrew his gaze, and said in a respectful manner, "You're far too kind, your majesty." Josh put down the kettle of ice water, and the burning sensation in his throat had subsided. He adjusted his clothes, and said with a smile, "Father, Master Meg's culinary skills are already top-notch in Chaos City. Before coming here, he even defeated the #1 chef in Chaos City in a cooking competition, so he definitely deserves to be named the best dish by you." "That's very thoughtful of you, your majesty." The king nodded as he looked at Mag, and said, "Master Mag's culinary skills are superb, and I'm very pleased with all of the dishes that he made. As such, I've decided to reward him with 1,000 dragon coins and appoint him as the assistant chef of the royal kitchen. He can take up the position immediately." A commotion immediately erupted in the palace, and all of the officials wore astonished expressions on their faces. "Your Majesty, I shouldn't be making excuses, but I already have a restaurant in Chaos City, so please forgive me for not being able to stay in the palace." Chapter 751. The entire palace suddenly fell silent, and all of the officials stared at Meg with wide eyes as if they were looking at an idiot. The vice-manager position was second only to Bellman in the entire royal kitchen. Bellman had spent 10 years to reach that position, but Meg had achieved it with just 3 dishes. For a commoner chef like him, this was a meteoric rise for the king's vassal. The king's decision had sent all of the officials into an uproar as this was a very unusual decision. Countless chefs were racking their brains to become the best chef of this royal banquet in order to earn an opportunity to work in the royal kitchen. However, this chef from Chaos City was turning down the king's reward. Furthermore, the reason he used was that there was a restaurant in Chaos City. "Are you an idiot?" Some of the officials were already hurling vulgarities. This was an invitation from the king of the Roth Empire. How could the king's restaurant in Chaos City be inferior to the customers of the king's? There was no need to think about such a question, but this guy had chosen such an absurd answer. Holy fuck. He. Isn't he the owner of Kerry's Rotisserie who was selling beef cubes at noon yesterday? Abraham stared at Meg with wide eyes, and almost jumped out of his chair. No wonder he's able to cook such delicious braised chicken and rice. It makes sense that he's a chef who can cook such delicious roast beef cubes. Abraham took a few deep breaths to calm himself down as he looked at Mag with a complex expression. He had thought that two super chefs had suddenly appeared in Rodu, but who would have thought that they would be the same chef? Furthermore, he had run into him again, so he was very lucky. All of Josh's officials were starting to get a little nervous. They had thought that it would be great news for the second prince that Meg had won the best chef of the royal banquet. However, Meg's words could very well infuriate His Majesty, and all of their previous efforts would be for naught. Josh shot a few meaningful glances at Meg. Even though Meg had already told him in advance that he was going back to Chaos City, and he had agreed to that. However, he never thought that Meg would actually be able to obtain the Palace Banquet's Best Chef award. Furthermore, his imperial father liked him so much. If he could stay in the dining hall and cook for his imperial father every day, it would be extremely beneficial to him. Meg was looking down at the ground with a slightly fearful expression, so he was able to perfectly avoid Joshua's gaze. What a joke! How many customers were still crying piteously for food at the entrance of the restaurant? How could he stay in the palace and be a canary for this old thing? He was afraid that one day, he would not be able to resist putting some poison in the food and kill this family of bad things. Sean's eyes gradually lit up after being tortured by insanely spicy. He handed the ice water bottle in his hand to the maid beside him and adjusted his clothes again with a smile on his face. How dare you? You unruly commoner, who gave you the courage to speak to His Majesty like this? How many people want to enter the royal dining hall but can't? His Majesty rewarded you heavily and let you become the Deputy General Manager of the royal dining hall. You actually used the reason of opening a restaurant as an excuse to refuse. Could it be that in your eyes, the royal dining hall cannot compare to that little restaurant of yours? Is His Majesty inferior to those customers of yours? A burly official abruptly rose to his feet and pointed at Meg with an agitated expression as he yelled. Meg didn't even have to turn around to know that this official from the Ministry of War was one of Sean's most trusted subordinates. It was not appropriate for Sean to kick someone when they were down, so he naturally had his lackeys do the dirty work. However, he wasn't someone who would allow himself to be bitten so easily. He turned to that official and said, "That's not right. I'm just a small chef in Chaos City, and I was invited by His Majesty to cook for His Majesty. Prior to coming here, I had already agreed to return to Chaos City in 5 days, and His Majesty had already agreed. Hence, I specially put up a notice at the entrance of the restaurant to inform our regular customers that we will return in 5 days. My restaurant is a small business, so it naturally can't compare to the royal dining hall. Furthermore, most of our customers are ordinary citizens, so they can't be compared to His Majesty. However, I believe that honesty should be the foundation of our business. Seeing as I've already agreed to return to the restaurant in 5 days, I naturally can't lie to my customers. As such, I can only decline His Majesty's invitation. I truly have no choice but to do so." Meg was a professional when it came to shirking responsibility. All of the officials immediately fell silent upon hearing Meg's words, and all of them turned to Josh. If what Meg had said was true, then his actions were completely justified. Instead, he was a good boss who treated his customers with sincerity. Josh suddenly regretted his decision to accept Meg's offer. However, Meg had already made the offer, so he could only grit his teeth and continue. "Father, Master Meg has indeed discussed this matter with me. Master Meg treats all of his customers well, and he really is a good boss." Yesterday, at the Ranher Food Street, Josh gave Mag a brief recount of the events that had transpired at Kerry's rotisserie the day before, and he successfully portrayed Mag as a good chef who was willing to serve his customers for the sake of the commoners. Of course, this kind of story wasn't something that the officials could relate to at all. The thought of having to sit next to a commoner at the Ranher Food Street in the future made them want to curse out loud. Wow. He challenged the best rotisserie in the world and won. He's so cool. He's fighting for the commoners. He's so compassionate. He's such a straightforward person. He's so cool. Crap, I'm falling in love with him. All of the young women were looking at Meg with stars in their eyes. A man like him was a perfect fit for the image of a hero in their hearts. Coupled with his handsome looks and irresistible food, their hearts were thumping like little fawns. Flirting with girls is the most lethal. Meg listened to all of the young women's praise for him in a resigned manner. He was so perfect that even he was feeling a little embarrassed. Irina was still a little nervous, but a hint of a smile appeared on Meg's face, and she couldn't help but clench her fists as she cursed, "Stinky men are all pig trotters. It's the honor of every chef to be able to cook for His Majesty. This Master Meg was invited here by His Highness. Didn't he inform him of the rules before coming here? He won the Best Dish award, but he wants to open a restaurant in Chaos City instead of staying at the Royal Kitchen. If news of this were to spread, what would become of the reputation of our Roth Empire? What would become of our dignity as the king?" Sean stood up and looked at Josh with an intense gaze. Josh furrowed his brows. Sean's sudden entrance and the two accusations he was trying to accuse him of were quite difficult for him to deal with. Our Chaos City is quite small, but it's still a city that can accommodate Master Meg's restaurant. Meg's eyes of the goddesses of the world of Chaos City were, and he of course, of Novan of the world. This was of the of chaos. Although Mag had accepted this reality after coming to this world, he didn't feel any sense of belonging to this world aside from Amy and the restaurant. He didn't even know if he belonged to the Roth Empire or Chaos City. But now, he seemed to have an answer in his heart. Not for anything else, but for that sentence: if he returns, Chaos City will definitely welcome him. Novan actually spoke up for him, and even brought out the entire Chaos City. I didn't think that the conflict between the demons and the dragons would have something to do with him. All of the officials were looking at Meg with shock on their faces. They had thought that he was just a chef with superb culinary skills, but they didn't think that he would have such an unknown identity. Amy looked up at Crassus, and pouted as she said, "Master, I want to go back to Chaos City too. Our restaurant is there. Jessica, Daphne, Big Sister Aisha, Big Sister MIA. They're all there." Crassus looked at the pitiful Amy, and his heart softened immediately. He nodded without any hesitation, and said, all right, we'll definitely go back." Luna looked at Meg with a concerned expression. She knew that Meg would definitely want to go back to Chaos City, but she didn't think that the situation would become so urgent. Sean looked at Novan. He didn't think that Novan would be so decisive and even bring up Chaos City for a mere chef. What kind of status does this guy have in Chaos City? Why is he so important to Novan? He hesitated for a moment, and said, "This matter, isn't the second prince being a little too proactive? This Mr. Mac is the father of my disciple. In Chaos City, you'll have to line up for a meal at his restaurant. If those regulars don't have Mr. Mac's dishes, they'll all die. You're forcing him to stay in the palace, aren't you cutting off our food supply?" Crassus looked at Sean with a displeased expression. Sean's eyebrows twitched again. Novan was already giving him a headache, and now, Crassus was even more difficult to deal with. If Crassus were to side with Josh again because of this matter, that would be the most unacceptable thing for him. His heart had already sunk to rock bottom. He's the father of Master Crassus' disciple? What kind of luck does he have to give birth to such an outstanding daughter? A commotion immediately broke out upon hearing that. The father of a once-in-a-lifetime prodigy was a very prestigious title. He already has a daughter. All of the female guests were instantly filled with grief. To be able to give birth to such a beautiful daughter, she had to be an extremely beautiful elf, so their chances were close to zero. Right at this moment, Byron Field stood up, and cupped his fist in a salute toward the king as he said, "Your Majesty, not only is Mr. Meg an exceptional chef, he's also a prodigy mathematician. The mathematical system debate that I've been hosting recently was inspired by the multiplication table that he created. If this table can be popularized, it would be a massive improvement for the Norland continent's mathematic. As such, I believe that we shouldn't punish Mr. Meg severely. Instead, we should treat him with kindness." The entire palace erupted into a frenzy upon hearing that. Lord Byron was the Minister of Education in the Roth Empire, and he was an extremely respected figure in the world of mathematics. Yet, he was saying that Meg was an arithmetic prodigy. Not only did he take home the Best Chef award, but he was also a prodigy mathematician. Everyone was unable to wrap their heads around this sudden change in status, and they were all looking at Meg in a different light. This man really was difficult to see through. This guy. Sean also took a glance at Meg. He had initially thought that this man could be Alex, but that thought had already been completely overturned. Chapter 753. That's enough. The king raised a hand, and the entire palace fell silent. Seeing as Master Meg doesn't want to stay in the royal kitchen, I won't force you. However, the 3 dishes presented to me today are the most delicious dishes I've ever tasted, and they're undoubtedly the best dishes at a royal banquet. The king looked at Meg and said, "Reward him with 1,000 dragon coins and a plaque that reads Best of the Royal Banquet. You may hang it in the restaurant." "Thank you, Your Majesty." Meg extended a grateful bow toward the king. However, he couldn't help but grumble internally, "How can I hang something like that in my restaurant?" The king nodded and said, "Master Meg is an esteemed guest of City Lord Michael, the father of Master Crassus' disciple, and the prodigy mathematician that Byron spoke of, so there's no need for you to leave. You may sit." "Thank you, Your Majesty," Meg said respectfully. He was quite pleased with this reward. He had never been to a royal banquet before, so it was naturally very interesting to be able to spectate from the sidelines. His Majesty actually agreed. All of the officials were quite surprised. However, they were very curious about what was so special about Meg that he was able to garner the support of so many powerful figures. This debate had been sparked by Meg, and Meg was clearly the final victor. Isn't he illiterate? How did he become a prodigy mathematician in just 3 years? Could it be that aside from learning how to cook, he's also been learning how to calculate behind my back? Irina appraised Meg with an appraising expression, and was even more curious about what else he had learned that she didn't know about. Sean wore a slightly gloomy expression, but he still sat back down in silence. He had really hit the nail on the head this time. Not only did he fail to embarrass Josh, he even pushed Crassus and Chaos City toward Josh. In contrast, Josh was unable to hide the elation in his eyes. He was the one who had recommended Meg to him, and he had thought that he was just a chef. Who would have thought that he would be so capable? The group of educators and writers led by Byron Field held high positions, but they thought highly of themselves and had never expressed any intention of taking sides. They were the most fence-sitters in the Roth Empire's bureaucracy. If Meg could infiltrate their inner circle and make them his supporters, it would undoubtedly be a great help to him. Byron sat down. Luna had already poured a cup of tea and placed it in front of him, her face filled with a happy smile. Byron glanced at the cup of tea before turning to Luna with a helpless expression. "Are you that happy just because I helped him? Mr. Meg is someone who loves freedom. Chaos City is more suitable for him. Luna is naturally happy that Grandpa is speaking up for him." Luna nodded with a smile. "I don't think that's the case." Byron took a sip of tea and said meaningfully. Meg cupped his fist in gratitude toward Byron before making his way over to Amy and the others. A servant had already brought chairs over, and he sat down beside Crassus. Meg immediately turned to the 2 people beside him, and said, "Thank you for speaking up for me, Principal Novan and Master Crassus." Novan looked at Meg and shook his head as he said, "I should be the one thanking Mr. Meg for being willing to return to Chaos City. There's no need to stand on ceremony, Mr. Mac." Crassus waved a nonchalant hand. "Father." Amy burrowed into Meg's arms with elation. Even though they hadn't seen each other for an entire morning, she still missed him very much. "Good girl." Amy placed Amy on her lap and stroked her hair with a smile. She took a glance at Irina and averted her gaze nervously as she looked away. Women were indeed a little scary. The intimate interaction between the father and daughter drew many envious glances. It was every man's dream to have such an adorable and talented daughter. Of course, the women also wished that they were the ones who could sit on such a perfect man's lap. Amy leaned over to Meg and whispered into his ear, "Father, I think big sister Irina has already fallen in love with you." Huh? Meg faltered slightly upon hearing this. "Because she ate all 3 of your dishes, and she looked like she really liked them, so she must have already fallen in love with you." "No woman can resist your delicious food," Amy said with a serious expression. "Little girl." Meg couldn't help but poke Amy's little forehead with a smile. She really was a little girl who dared to say anything. The king gave the final word, and the debate came to an end. "So this is the guy who tricked Tauros and Dracula and caused us to lose a crucial island. That damned bastard." Gajiel, the representative of the demon race, glowered at Meg with a dark expression. The conflict between the 2 races several months ago had ended in a peaceful resolution, and they hadn't reaped any benefits. It could be said that they had made a wasted trip. Could it be that he's the human who can cook delicious food that Jinx was talking about? Golden Dragon Bruno was also looking at Meg with a hint of surprise on his face. He thought about it momentarily before nodding as he said, "Jinx wasn't lying to me. The food that this human cooks is indeed very delicious. It's just that the portion is a little too small." Mag was also appraising everyone in the palace in a discreet manner. Josh and Sean didn't need to be mentioned, but the 4 portions of spicy grilled fish was a small revenge. Richard had just met Mag the day before, and he was currently glaring at Mag with a dark expression, as if he wanted nothing more than to kill him. Orcs, demons, forest trolls, dwarfs, goblins, elves, giant dragons. All of the representatives of the various races had distinctive characteristics. Meg's gaze lingered on the burly man in golden armor who had a dragon tail with fine golden scales trailing behind him. That dragon tail was extremely familiar. Wasn't it the same dragon tail that MIA had transformed into after eating Ruggiamo? Could it be that MIA really is a half-dragon born from the union of a golden dragon and a human? Furthermore, there's an extremely high chance that she'll be able to successfully complete her transformation. Meg was rather surprised to see this, and he committed that golden dragon's appearance to memory. If he had the opportunity, perhaps he could find out more about this half-dragon transformation from him. If MIA was willing, perhaps she could even travel to the Golden Dragon tribe to find her father. Of course, if he had already recovered his powers by then he wouldn't mind giving that scumbag a good beating. The entire nation is celebrating the king's birthday, and all of our guests are here to celebrate. Now, please come in and present your birthday gift," the chief steward announced in a loud and clear voice. The hall instantly fell silent as everyone turned to look at Josh and Sean. It was the king's birthday, so there was naturally no lack of birthday gifts. As for the other birthday gifts, that was just a matter of pride. However, the first prince and the second prince's birthday gifts would garner a lot of attention. "Hurry up, you idiot. If we don't present our gifts in time, we'll have prepared for nothing." The king looked at the heartless smile on Yuri's face, and the displeasure in his heart dissipated. Instead, he was feeling a little sorry for his youngest son, who had barely received any attention from him. He nodded and said, "Have a seat." "Thank you, Imperial Father." Yuri nodded with a smile. He looked around, but couldn't find a place to sit. He was the third prince, yet there was no place prepared for him in this hall. Even the attendants had neglected him. The attendant's expression changed drastically upon seeing this, and he hurried over to fetch a chair, but he didn't know where to place it. His Highness the Third Prince's status was naturally honorable, but to say who would be ranked ahead of him was another difficult problem for them. For a moment, they were as anxious as ants on a hot pan. "Little mushroom head, come sit with me," Irina said with a smile as she waved a hand at Yuri. "Well." A conflicted look appeared on Yuri's face, and he cast a glance at Meg and Amy, looking as if he wanted to slip away. A cruel smile appeared on Irina's face. "Sure." Yuri shuddered upon hearing this, and he made his way over to Irina with a bashful expression. The smile on his face was even uglier than if he were crying. The attendant hurriedly brought a chair over to Irina, and only then did he heave a sigh of relief. "She really is a smart woman, but it looks like she's treating Yuri quite well," isn't she? Meg took a glance at Irina. There was most likely no seat in the palace that was more suitable for Yui than the one beside Irina. Irina's seat was just below Josh's, so Yui's position as the third prince was just right, so he wouldn't be placed in an awkward position. Yui sat down beside Irina in a bashful manner, and he took the initiative to scoot his chair over to the side. His legs were crossed, and he wore a nervous expression as he forced a smile onto his face. "Little mushroom head, it's been 3 years since we last met, and your head has grown even bigger." Irina made her way over to Yuri and carefully inspected his head with a curious look on her face. "Other people grow taller because of their bodies, but you've grown taller because of your head." Yuri leaned back to evade the evil hand that was trying to caress his head. Big sister Irina was a childhood trauma for him, and he even had a feeling that his head had grown so big because she had rubbed it too much when he was a child. Big sister Irina had once lived in the royal palace for a period of time, and she had displayed a great interest in his head ever since he was a child. If it weren't for General Alex's sake, he definitely wouldn't have allowed her to ravage his head like this. Of course, he couldn't resist even if he wanted to. Back when he was still carving wood, he had once dreamed of becoming a knight, and his goal at the time was none other than General Alex, who was at the height of his powers. However, before he had a chance to take the first step toward his dream, news of Alex's death reached him. This was undoubtedly a lethal blow to his dream, and from then on, he only focused on wood carving and some interesting craftsmanship. Irina looked at the scene before withdrawing her hand in the end. She couldn't help but want to rub his head every time she saw it, and she didn't harbor any ill will toward him, she just wanted to rub his head. "Let the birthday ceremony continue. Please present your gift, Your Highness." The attendant received the king's approval, and announced loudly. An attendant quickly strode into the hall with a long tray that was covered with a layer of red cloth. His forehead was sweating, and his hands were trembling slightly, so it was quite clear that the item on the tray wasn't light. Sean stood up and lifted the red cloth, and a golden red light shone out from under the red cloth, causing everyone to narrow their eyes. There was a large golden red sword on the tray, and it was engraved with domineering and regal carvings. The golden red light was extraordinary, and the sharp sword projection made everyone want to avoid it. "What's that?" Everyone looked at the sword with curiosity in their eyes, and it was clear that it was no ordinary sword. Chapter 755. There was an uproar in the hall after Sean said that. The human emperor was the one who revived the human race during the war among species. When the human race was on the brink of extinction, he led the human race to survive the war among species, and made the human race grow stronger and stronger in the decades he was in power, laying the foundation for the human race to become one of the major races on the Norland continent. Because of that, he was also revered as the human emperor, and his sword, the Crimson Flame Sword, had once chopped off the head of a giant dragon, so it was quite famous. After his death, it was rumored that the Crimson Flame Sword was sunk in the Inferno Pond. However, thousands of years had passed, and countless people had risked their lives to enter the Inferno Pond, but they had never found this legendary human emperor's sword. All the rulers of the human race wanted to find this human emperor's sword, but none of them succeeded. Who would have thought that Sean would find it, and give it to the king as a birthday gift? One could only imagine the importance and significance of this gift. All the representatives of the various races didn't look too good. Seeing this sword, many of them were reminded of that lunatic, the human emperor. If it weren't for him, the human race would be just food in the mountains now. The Crimson Flame Sword. The king's eyes lit up, and he slowly stood up from his chair. He reached out to take the sword from Sean's hand, and his old face glowed red as if he had become a lot younger all of a sudden. Back then, he had also used this sword to kill enemies at the border. He didn't expect to get this Crimson Flame Sword when he was old. A warm feeling came from the hilt, and it was as if he wasn't holding a sword, but a ball of fire. It even gave him the urge to pick up the sword and duel with someone. As a king, who didn't want to be like the human emperor? After being in power for several decades, the praise he liked to hear the most was that he was like the human emperor. Now, with the human emperor's sword in hand, the human race was on equal footing with all the other races. On the day of his birthday, All the races came to celebrate, and Andre felt a sense of pride. Andre held the sword in his hand and examined it for a long time. He nodded at Sean and praised, "Good sword. As long as you like it, father." Joy flashed across Sean's eyes. He took the sword, put it on the tray, and sat down again. Judging from his father's reaction, the countless efforts he had spent on this sword were not in vain. All of Sean's subordinates naturally took this opportunity to praise Sean, and tried their best to portray him as a filial son with great ambitions. Mag looked at the crimson flame sword. The fact that it was able to remain completely unscathed after being submerged in the lava for 1,000 years indicated that it was an exceptional sword. The king was clearly very pleased with it, and he glanced at Sean as he said, "You're quite smart. You picked the right time for the king to be concerned about his reputation. This is most likely the best sword for the day. You're amazing, brother." Yui clapped his hands in amazement, but soon said confidently, "But, no matter how special the Scarlet Flame Sword is, it's definitely not as special as the gift I prepared." Of. Irina withdrew her hand. She nodded. "All right. If it's not fun, then you know the consequences. It's going to be fun." Yui was full of confidence. Josh's expression darkened. It wasn't that he hadn't tried to obtain the human emperor's sword before. It was just that he had never heard of it. Never did he think that it would fall into Sean's hands. He had thought that with Meg's spectacular performance, he would be the star of this birthday celebration. However, he had lost all of his confidence. "Your Highness, please present your gift." The attendant held the scarlet flame sword and retreated. The previous attendant continued to shout. Josh rose to his feet. Another attendant also entered the palace with a tray covered with a red cloth. What kind of treasure will His Highness present? His Highness presented the crimson flame sword. If His Highness's gift isn't special enough, then it's going to be inferior. All of the officials craned their necks to look on with curiosity in their eyes. Josh removed the red cloth, and a faint silver light shone from the tray. There was a perfectly round ball of ice on the tray, and at the center of the ball of ice was a silver Ganoderma. It was emanating a faint silver light as if it were alive. "Father, this is a 10,000-year-old snow Ganoderma that I found in the extreme cold of the north. Snow Ganoderma only appears occasionally under glacier. Consuming this 10,000-year-old snow Ganoderma can prolong one's life," Josh introduced with a solemn expression. Normal snow Ganoderma was already extremely precious. It was said that consuming it could cleanse countless toxins and prolong one's life. A 10,000-year-old snow Ganoderma was even more unheard of. That was enough to show just how precious this little Ganoderma was. All of the officials' eyes lit up. All of them were in their 50s, and all of them wanted to live for a few more years. If they ate this thing, it would be difficult for them not to live for a few more years. The king took a glance at the 10,000-year-old snow Ganoderma and nodded. "You're very thoughtful, Josh. If it weren't for the scarlet flame sword, this 10,000-year-old snow Ganoderma would undoubtedly be an extremely precious item." It was of a higher grade than the countless treasures in the palace. However, after obtaining the scarlet flame sword, this 10,000-year-old snow Ganoderma seemed a lot more ordinary. Josh nodded and sat down. This 10,000-year-old snow Ganoderma had cost him a lot of money, but he didn't receive any praise from his father. It was still a little hard for him to accept. "I'd like to see if a chef or the scarlet flame sword is more important in my father's heart." Sean glanced at Josh, and the pride in his eyes was not concealed in the slightest. All of the officials saw the king's reaction. This time, Sean's gift was clearly superior. "Your Highness, please present your gift," the attendant called out. There wasn't much anticipation on the faces of the officials. The third prince's birthday gift hadn't been missed year after year, but there was nothing new every year. Even with their eyes closed, everyone could guess that the gift this time would definitely be a wooden carving that he made himself, and it was very likely that he would take it out directly from his pocket. The third prince, who was obsessed with wooden carvings, probably felt that there was no gift in the world more precious than his wooden carvings, so his gifts never changed. Yui stood up, and his expression was slightly solemn and serious. 4 guards used 2 thick logs to carry a 1-meter square box covered with a red cloth into the door. Looking at the guards' footsteps, the box seemed to be a little heavy. What's this? All of the officials were really curious now. The size of this gift surpassed all of the previous gifts combined. Chapter 756. Just as everyone was looking on expectantly, the red cloth was lifted, and a black wooden block that was about a meter in size appeared before everyone's eyes. The black wooden block was a single piece, and its surface was very smooth. It was exactly because of this that they could only see some of the original patterns on the wood, and not a single trace of carving. It was just a huge block of wood. This is the wood that His Highness spent half a year to polish? Could it be that he started from a tree? Even the carving has been omitted. All of the officials who were full of anticipation couldn't hide their disappointment, and felt as if they had been played. However, on second thought, it wasn't normal for them to have expectations of the third prince, so they could only swallow their anger. Meg looked at the block of wood, and raised an eyebrow. This guy is more interesting than I thought. Is he really trying to piss his father off? This block of wood is quite square. The representative of the demon race, Gil, was already laughing out loud. The other representatives also couldn't hide their smiles. Sean and Josh had both presented extremely rare treasures, and that was enough to show how filial and capable the 2 princes were. However, the third prince had actually given him a black square piece of wood. What a joke! However, if it weren't for this prince, they would have almost forgotten that there was a third prince in the Roth Empire, and that he was such a stupid fool. Yuri, what's with this block of wood? The king's expression was also rather dark. The wood carvings that Yuri had presented in the past weren't very elegant, but they were all very intricate, and that was enough to show his sincerity. However, he had only presented a block of wood today, and he even said that he had spent half a year preparing it. Could it be that she thought he was old and could use such brainless words to deceive him? Furthermore, he had embarrassed him on such an occasion. Father, this is actually not an ordinary block of wood. This wood has been carefully polished by me, and then painted with a meticulously developed obsidian lacquer. It's harder than iron, and has extremely strong resistance. Yuri gently stroked that piece of wood with his hand, and then jumped onto it. He patted the wood with a smug smile, and said, also, look at its height, it's just right for an adult. Sitting on top of it, I can feel a slight chill, and it's very comfortable. So, is this a stool as hard as iron? Gurgil burst into raucous laughter upon hearing this. Andre and his 2 sons were both very difficult to deal with, and he didn't think that Andre would have such a foolish son. It was indeed a great pleasure to say something that could embarrass Andre. The various representatives began to laugh. Even some of the Roth Empire's ministers couldn't help but laugh along. The Roth Empire is going to become the laughingstock of all the races because of the third prince. There were also some ministers who looked at Yuri angrily, angry that he didn't fight. Yuri, you. The king's beard was trembling with rage, and he had already decided that Yuri would no longer be allowed to participate in any of the royal family's activities. This little guy is still as silly as before. Irina shook her head. Father, why did Mushroom Head give his father a piece of wood? Amy asked with a curious look on her face. Meg contemplated momentarily before replying, he's probably just a fool. Josh hurriedly rose to his feet, and said, my third brother is just being filial. It's just that he's still very young, and he's always been obsessed with woodcarving, so it's inevitable that he would be biased in his gift. I hope father won't hold it against him. Sean took a glance at Josh before also rising to his feet, and said, Father, my third brother is still very young, and hasn't studied much. Please forgive him, father. The king's fury subsided slightly as he looked at the 2 of them. You're the one who hasn't studied much, big brother. I read 5 books every day, and I've already read all of the books in the royal library twice. Yuri retorted with an indignant expression. The king's expression darkened upon hearing this, and he was just about to fly into a rage again. Sean also raised an eyebrow upon hearing this. He had only stepped forward to put in a few good words for Josh because he could see that Josh was putting on a show of hypocrisy. However, not only did Josh not appreciate his kindness, he even dared to ridicule him. He was asking for trouble. The chair is actually only the most common way of using it. Yuri seemed to be completely oblivious to everyone's mocking and enraged expressions as he pressed a corner of the wooden block with a smile, and said, "Now, it's time to witness a miracle." Crack, crack, crack. Along with a cracking sound, the seemingly seamless piece of wood instantly disintegrated into countless pieces of wood. They climbed up from Yuri's feet and enveloped him completely in an instant, forming a layer of wooden shell. Yuri, who was sitting on the wooden block, had transformed into a black giant over 2 meters tall in the blink of an eye. He had an inky black body, a suit of silver armor, and a rather serious expression on his massive wooden head. It was just that he was slightly larger than normal, but he struck everyone with a sense of awe and intimidation. What? The commotion in the hall instantly subsided, and everyone's eyes widened with astonishment as they looked at the wooden giant standing at the center of the hall. A seemingly ordinary square block of wood had turned into a giant in the blink of an eye. This operation was almost dazzling. Could this be magic? But that block of wood really did exist. So this was the gift that the third prince had presented to the king, and everyone was stunned by its beauty. Compared to the wooden carvings that he had presented in the past, this transformative giant was indeed more intimidating. However, why did this wooden giant look so familiar? "Isn't that General Alex?" a military general asked with an excited expression. "It really is General Alex." The entire hall instantly erupted into a frenzy. "Alex!" A cold light flashed through Josh's eyes at the sight of the wooden giant. This was a face that he didn't want to see again for the rest of his life. Sean was also looking at Yuri with a cold expression. This guy really doesn't know what he's talking about. Irina was a little absent-minded as she looked at the wooden giant. She then turned her attention to Meg, who was also staring at the wooden giant, and pursed her lips. "He doesn't look like that anymore." Meg was indeed appraising the wooden giant with a serious expression. It had to be said that Yuri's carving skills were truly exceptional. The carvings on this human head were extremely intricate, and the contours of his face were clearly defined. He couldn't be considered handsome, but he was very memorable. Even though it was only a wooden carving, the resolute look in his eyes still made one want to involuntarily back away. He was the king standing there. So that's what he looks like. He doesn't look like me at all. Could it be that he took my photo and went for plastic surgery? Meg thought to himself, and his emotions were a little complex. Countless memories flashed through his mind, all of which were of his glorious past. Chapter 757. Because he's also your father. Meg looked at Amy with a complex expression as he stroked Amy's hair. He was Megshan, but he was also Meg Alex. This was already set in stone from the moment that their memories had been fused. He was willing to shoulder all of the responsibilities that Meg Alex had to shoulder, but he also wanted to live his life in his own way. Meg felt as if he had found his true self as he looked at the wooden giant. Holy fuck! Isn't that a transformer? No, it should be a low-end version of a Gundam. However, Meg still couldn't help but grumble internally. Who would have thought that this guy would be such a prodigy? He's even able to create a Gundam at such a young age. I wonder if he can move. Meg reassessed Yuri in his heart. He was truly stunned by the sight of the wooden block transforming into a wooden giant. It was no less impressive than the special effects in Hollywood blockbusters, and most importantly, this was happening right before his eyes without any special effects. This clearly wasn't a simple mechanism. Instead, a magic formation had been added into the structure. However, how boring was it to be able to split a large wooden block into countless smaller pieces before piecing them together to create a wooden giant? This was just like how Meg couldn't understand his dorm mate's behavior. He was willing to spend days and nights, even forgetting to eat, just to create a Gundam. Was it because the girls outside weren't pretty enough? Meg was quite impressed with Yuri's creativity, but it wasn't a wise decision to associate himself with Alex at a time like this. Regardless of which of his two older brothers took over the throne in the future, They most likely wouldn't go easy on a younger brother who was still obsessed with Alex. Alex. Gajeel abruptly rose to his feet and glowered at the wooden giant. The fury in his eyes was almost tangible, and there was even a dark light emanating from his hands. Irina took a glance at Gajeel with a hint of mockery in her eyes. "Old pig, are you afraid of even a wooden giant? Looks like you still remember what happened back then." Gajeel's expression darkened slightly, but a cold sneer quickly appeared on his face as he sat down. "Mph, it's just a piece of dead wood. That guy died a long time ago. It seems that some people are still itching for a beating." Irina's expression also immediately cooled as she appraised Gajeel with a frosty expression. The ambush 3 years ago definitely had something to do with the demon race, but she didn't know who was involved. "Don't worry, I'll take you to him sooner or later." Gajeel glared at Irina with a vicious smile on his face, but he didn't say anything further. Irina's expression was cold, and she did not say anything either. She glanced at Meg and Amy out of the corner of her eye, but there was a hint of gentleness in her eyes. "Big sister Irina seems to know this wooden man." Amy muttered to herself as she looked curiously at the inexplicably angry Irina. Meg hugged Amy gently and did not explain anything to her. The various representatives looked at the wooden figure with different expressions. Everyone was aware of the relationship between Irina and Alex, and Gajeel had already served as an example, so no one wanted to incur the wrath of the elven princess who had stayed in the wind forest for 3 years. After all, news had just spread that she had slain a 10th-tier elven magic caster not too long ago. She had never been a stickler for rules, and if she was displeased, she could even attack someone in this hall. "I'm not a piece of dead wood, I can move." Yuri's indignant voice sounded from within the wooden figure again. The extremely heavy wooden figure raised its right foot, then raised its left foot again. Even though it appeared to be a little clumsy, it was still controllable. This is a magic core control technique. If it can be used in battle, then it really is a Gundam. Meg's eyes almost popped out of their sockets as he looked at the wooden figure. Even though it could only perform simple movements, the wooden figure that Yuri had created was already close to a robot that had been created by a civilization on Earth for thousands of years. On top of that, he was only 15 years old, so he was an absolute prodigy. Yuri's clumsy movements made many people burst into laughter. General Alex was the hero of the Empire, and the entire Empire was in mourning when news of his death spread 3 years ago. Yuri's exquisite carving skills had almost completely recreated General Alex's appearance, and the fact that it had been transformed from a wooden box into something like this was far beyond everyone's expectations. All of the officials were looking at Yuri in a new light. "Alex." The king looked at the wooden figure with a complex expression. "Your Majesty, I think it's inappropriate for His Highness to sculpt General Alex's appearance. How could such a joke be worthy of General Alex?" Right at this moment, a general stood up and yelled. The commotion in the hall gradually subsided, and everyone's expressions gradually changed again as they looked at the wooden figure. Even though they were all stunned by Yuri's creativity, this was General Alex. After all, how could it be made into a toy? No matter how well it was made, it was still just a toy. It was already common knowledge that the third prince was a playboy, but now, he even dared to insult General Alex. He was simply being rude. These guys really are trying to protect their master. Meg took a glance at Slog, and discovered that he wasn't one of Alex's former subordinates. Instead, he was Sean's lackey, and it appeared that he didn't want Yuri to steal the limelight from his master. The king's brows furrowed as if he were contemplating something, but also seemed to be a little displeased. "Who said this is a toy? This is a suit of armor, not a toy. Alex is a battle god, and I'm going to use this suit of armor to become a battle god like him. Why can't I use it?" Yuri raised his right hand with an enraged expression. Slog's furious expression remained as he turned to Yuri, and he asked, "General Alex is the most powerful dragon-slaying knight on the Norland continent. How can you compare a wooden figure to him, Your Highness? Are you going to use this wooden figure to slaughter your enemies like a general?" All of the officials in the hall were also looking at the wooden figure with a hint of mockery in their eyes. Yuri was completely powerless, yet he dared to say that he could use this wooden figure to become a battle god like Alex. What an arrogant claim. This wooden figure looked like it was having a hard time even walking. What kind of suit of armor was this? Could it be that it was just a suit of armor that possessed powerful defensive capabilities? In that case, how was it any different from a turtle shell? A mocking smile appeared on Sean's face. A brother like Yuri didn't even have the right to be his opponent. Is it fun to bully a little kid? Meg's brows furrowed as he thought to himself. Just as everyone thought that Yuri was going to give in. Chapter 758. The entire palace instantly fell deathly silent. Everyone stared at the wooden golem with wide eyes, and for a split second, they felt as if the invincible war god had returned. However, the person in the wooden golem was Yuri, not Alex, so how could he dare to challenge Slog? Wasn't that asking for defeat? Slog also faltered slightly upon seeing this. When the wooden golem extended its finger, he almost fell to his knees. However, he quickly came to his senses. Alex was already dead, and the person in the wooden golem was the powerless Yuri. A sense of rage welled up in Slog's heart. He was a deputy general of the Northwestern Military Region, and even though he wasn't all that powerful, if he didn't even dare to accept Yuri's challenge, then he would most likely become the laughingstock of the entire empire, let alone be promoted. Soleg turned around and cupped his hands respectfully toward the king as he said, "Your Majesty, since His Highness the Third Prince insists on a duel, I would like to make a bold request to have a duel with His Highness the Third Prince in this palace without using any weapons. Would that be possible?" Everyone turned to the king. Slog had accepted the Third Prince's challenge, and only the king could decide whether the two of them would accept the duel. Even though Yuri wasn't the king's favorite child, he was still the Third Prince, and not just anyone could bully him. His wooden box had already been mocked by all of the representatives of the various races, and the wooden box had been reconstructed into Alex's body. Now that Slog was going to challenge Yuri to a duel, if Yuri were to lose, then the royal family would be humiliated. Amy looked at the wooden golem with a curious expression. Does Mushroom Head know how to fight? But that birdman of his can't even fly, so he can't defeat Yuri even after transforming into a wooden golem. Could it really be a Gundam? Meg was also quite curious. Even though Yuri was at the height of his youth, he didn't look like an idiot, so he most likely wouldn't do something that would embarrass himself. Little Mushroom Head can run into walls just by walking, yet he dares to challenge someone? What a rare sight. Irina was also looking on with anticipation, and she wasn't worried in the slightest. At the end of the day, Yuri was still the Third Prince. Even if Slog were 10 times more courageous, he still wouldn't dare to injure Yuri. He couldn't bear the consequences of doing so. "Father, please allow me to battle him." Yuri withdrew the hand that he was pointing at Slog, and turned to the king with a determined expression. The king looked at the wooden figure and was a little surprised. His youngest son, who had always been lazy, weak, and cowardly, had shown his courageous side today. After a moment of silence, he nodded and said, "Approved." The attendants quickly cleared the space in the center of the hall, and the ministers began to discuss in low voices. "General Soleg is a 5th-rank knight. Does your highness really want to fight him? Third Highness, you're neither a knight nor a magic caster. Are you trying to wear out General Sorg by wearing this indestructible wooden golem? Now that you mention it, it's possible. TCH, if only His Highness could be half as hardworking as the first and second princes and not indulge in those dirty tricks, he would be able to do much better." No one believed that Yuri would be able to defeat Slog with this wooden golem that he had created, and there were many who were lamenting Yuri's incompetence. The empty space was quickly cleared, and the two sides stood at the center of the space. Slog's height still only reached up to the wooden golem's neck, and his slightly raised head made him feel a little uncomfortable. The flames of fury in his heart burned even brighter, and he wanted nothing more than to crush this wooden golem's face with a single punch. "Please get ready, Your Highness and Master Slog. Don't injure one another," the attendants announced in a loud voice. The commotion in the hall gradually died down, and everyone stared intently at the two of them. Even though they weren't looking forward to the outcome of the battle, everyone was curious to see how long Yuri would be able to last. Slog twisted his neck, and a cracking sound rang out as he glared at Yuri with bulging eyes. He only needed one attack to take care of this brat. "Please excuse me, Your Highness," Slog roared as he charged toward Yuri like a ferocious bull. Yuri was the third prince, after all, so no matter how enraged he was, he didn't dare to hurt him in this hall. He was only doing this to impress Sean, and he was a military general, so he naturally couldn't appear weak. As for Yuri, he was a piece of trash to begin with, so there was no need for him to care about his reputation. Slog was striding forward with an imposing aura, and there was a stark contrast between Yuri, who was still standing there like a wooden stake. The outcome of this battle would most likely be decided in a single strike. Gurjeal wore a mocking expression on his face. Regardless of whether it was the third prince of the Roth Empire being defeated by a mere military general or Alex's wooden golem being trampled on, these were all scenes that he loved to see. Furthermore, he didn't have to do anything. "Good luck, Mushroom Head. Good luck." Amy cheered for Yuri in a quiet voice. She was still a little nervous, and her focused expression was quite adorable. Slog's right hand reached toward the wooden golem's neck, and he leaned to the side as he prepared to suplex Yuri before locking him in place to end this battle. The veins on his muscular arms were bulging. As a fifth-tier knight, his strength was already comparable to that of an ironhide bull, so dealing with a slow-moving wooden golem was naturally a piece of cake for him. A sinister smile appeared on Slog's face. Even though this was only a wooden golem that he could only look up to, he was still very excited to be able to defeat him. He felt as if he could already envision Alex being suplexed by himself. That would definitely be the highlight of his life. Some of the female guests had already covered their eyes. Alex had once been the dream lover of many women. Even though he was only a wooden golem, they didn't want to see him being defeated. A cold smile appeared on Sean's face. He was now rather curious as to whether Alex would also be trampled on like a wooden golem after he was found. Would he be challenged by ants who could only look up to him in the past? That was going to be very interesting. Everyone was waiting for Yuri's wooden puppet to be knocked down by a single blow, and then Solar would be the winner of this duel. However, right at this moment, the wooden golem suddenly raised its right hand, and its movements were no longer sluggish. A crisp crack rang out, and it latched onto Slog's wrist like a bolt of lightning. It then spun around in a fluid motion, and threw Slog forward with a perfect combination of arms and waist. Slog's massive body flew through the air in a graceful arc, and he was slammed heavily into the ground by the suplex. Chapter 759. The entire palace instantly fell deathly silent. Everyone stared at the wooden golem with wide eyes, and for a split second, they felt as if the invincible war god had returned. However, the person in the wooden golem was Yuri, not Alex, so how could he dare to challenge Slog? Wasn't that asking for defeat? Slog also faltered slightly upon seeing this. When the wooden golem extended its finger, he almost fell to his knees. However, he quickly came to his senses. Alex was already dead, and the person in the wooden golem was the powerless Yuri. A sense of rage welled up in Slog's heart. He was a deputy general of the northwestern military region, and even though he wasn't all that powerful, if he didn't even dare to accept Yuri's challenge, then he would most likely become a laughingstock in the future, let alone a promotion. Soleg turned around and cupped his hands respectfully toward the king as he said, "Your Majesty, since His Highness the Third Prince insists on a duel, I would like to make a bold request to have a duel with His Highness the Third Prince in this palace without using any weapons. Would that be possible?" Everyone turned to the king. Slog had accepted the Third Prince's challenge, and only the king could decide whether the two of them would accept the duel. Even though Yuri wasn't the king's favorite child, he was still the Third Prince, and not just anyone could bully him. He had already been ridiculed by all of the representatives of the various races for bringing out his wooden box, but the wooden box had been reconstructed into Alex's body. Now, Slog was going to challenge Yuri to a duel, and if Yuri were to lose, then the royal family would be humiliated. Amy looked at the wooden golem with a curious expression. Does Mushroom Head also know how to fight? But that birdman of his can't even fly. How can he defeat Yuri even after transforming into a wooden golem? Could it be that he really is a Gundam? Meg was also quite curious. Even though Yuri was at the height of his youth, he didn't look like an idiot, so he most likely wouldn't do something that would embarrass himself. Little Mushroom Head can run into walls just by walking, yet he dares to challenge someone? What a rare sight. Irina was also quite excited to see what would happen, and she wasn't worried in the slightest. At the end of the day, Yuri was still the third prince. Even if Slog were 10 times more courageous, he wouldn't dare to injure Yuri. He couldn't bear the consequences of doing so. Father, please allow me to battle him. Yuri withdrew the hand that he was pointing at Slog, and turned to the king with a determined expression. The king looked at the wooden figure and was a little surprised. His youngest son, who had always been lazy, weak, and cowardly, had shown his courageous side today. After a moment of silence, he nodded and said, "Approved." The attendants swiftly cleared the space in the center of the hall, while the ministers began to discuss in low voices. General Soleg is a 5th-rank knight. Does your highness really want to fight him? Third Highness, you're neither a knight nor a magic caster. Are you trying to wear out General Sorg by wearing this indestructible wooden golem? Now that you mention it, it's possible. TSK, if only His Highness could be half as hardworking as the first and second princes and not indulge in those dirty tricks, he would be able to do much better. No one believed that Yuri would be able to defeat Slog with the wooden dummy that he had created, and there were many people who were lamenting Yuri's incompetence. The empty space was quickly cleared, and the two sides stood at the center of the space. Even the tall and burly Solag only reached up to the wooden golem's neck, and the slightly raised head made him feel a little uncomfortable. The flames of fury in his heart burned even brighter, and he wanted nothing more than to punch this wooden golem to the ground and shatter its face. Please get ready, Your Highness and Master Slog. Don't injure anyone, the attendants announced in a loud voice. The commotion in the hall gradually died down, and everyone was staring intently at the two of them. Even though they weren't looking forward to the outcome of the battle, everyone was curious to see how long Yuri would be able to last. Slog twisted his neck, and a cracking sound rang out as he glared at Yuri with bulging eyes. He only needed one attack to take care of this brat. Please excuse me, Your Highness, Slog roared as he charged toward Yuri like a ferocious bull. Yuri was the third prince, after all, so no matter how furious he was, he didn't dare to hurt him in this hall. He was only doing this in order to impress Sean, and he was a general, so he naturally couldn't appear weak. As for Yuri, he was a piece of trash to begin with, so there was no need for him to care about what he thought. Slog was striding forward with an imposing aura, and there was a stark contrast between Yuri, who was still standing there like a wooden stake. The outcome of this battle would most likely be decided in a single strike. Gurgil wore a mocking expression on his face. Regardless of whether it was the third prince of the Roth Empire being defeated by a puny general or Alex's wooden golem being trampled on, these were all scenes that he loved to see. Furthermore, he didn't have to do anything. Go, Mushroom Head. Go for it. Amy cheered for Yuri in a quiet voice. There was a hint of nervousness on her little face, and her focused expression was very adorable. Slog's right hand reached toward the wooden golem's neck, and he leaned to the side as he prepared to suplex Yuri before locking him in place to end this battle. The veins on his muscular arms were bulging. As a 5th-tier knight, his strength was already comparable to that of an Ironhide bull, so dealing with a slow-moving wooden golem was naturally a piece of cake for him. A sinister smile appeared on Slog's face. Even though the person that he could only look up to in the past was nothing more than a wooden block, he was still very excited to be able to defeat him. He could already envision Alex being suplexed by himself. That would definitely be the highlight of his life. Some of the female guests had already covered their eyes. Alex had once been the dream lover of many women. Even though he was only a wooden golem, they didn't want to see him being taken down. A cold smile appeared on Sean's face. He was now rather curious as to whether Alex would also be trampled on like a wooden golem after he was found. Would he be challenged by ants who had once only been able to look up to him? That was going to be very interesting. Everyone was waiting for Yui's wooden puppet to be knocked down by a single blow, and then Sola would be the winner of this duel. However, right at this moment, the immobile wooden golem suddenly raised its right hand, and its movements were no longer sluggish. A crisp crack rang out as it latched onto Slog's wrist like a bolt of lightning. It then spun around in a fluid motion, and threw Slog forward with a perfect combination of arms and waist. Slog's massive body flew through the air in a graceful arc before being viciously slammed into the ground. You're tuning in to the Dreamy Chapters YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.